Listen here now, child. Come close, real close, 'cause what I'm about to tell you ain't written in no white man's book. Ain't carved on no fancy monument. No, sir. This here story lives in the wind that still whispers through them old cotton fields of Georgia. Lives in the red clay that drunk so much of our blood, it can't never forget. This is the tale of Maria Dutronco. That girl what was chained to a oak log for 60 days and 60 nights, under sun that burned like hellfire and rain that felt like the tears of every ancestor we lost in the Middle Passage. They say when she finally broke free, when she finally struck back, the earth itself shook. The master's skull split on that same trunk what held her prisoner, and the sound, Lord have mercy. The sound echoed across Willow Bend Plantation like thunder calling down the old gods from Guinea Coast. This ain't no make-believe, no fairy story to put children to sleep. This here's memory, sacred memory, blood memory. And if you listen real careful, on certain nights when the moon hangs low and the air sits heavy, you can still hear the chains rattling, still hear Maria's song rising from the quarters, still feel the spirit of resistance that couldn't be whipped out, couldn't be starved out, couldn't be buried in no wooden coffin half sunk in Georgia dirt. So settle yourself down. Open your ears and your heart, 'cause the ancestors got something to say, and Maria Dutronco's story needs telling one more time, needs passing on, needs to live forever in the mouths of the people who refuse to forget. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. In them days of deep sorrow, back in the 1830s when cotton was king, and black folks was less than cattle in the eyes of the law, there was born on the hard-packed dirt floor of a slave cabin a child what would grow to shake the very foundations of Willow Bend Plantation. Her name was Maria, though folks would come to call her by another name, a name that carried the weight of suffering and the fire of vengeance. Her mama, Adana, had survived what should have killed any soul. She'd been ripped from the shores of Angola, torn from her people like a branch from an ancient tree, and thrown into the belly of a slave ship called the Esperanza. A cursed name if ever there was one, 'cause there weren't no hope in that floating coffin. Down in that darkness, bodies piled like cordwood, chained ankle to ankle, wrist to wrist. The living and the dying pressed so close you couldn't tell one from the other. The stench, Lord of glory. The stench of death and despair and human waste hung so thick it coated your throat, made you wish for death just to escape it. Adana had seen children thrown overboard like garbage, watched strong men go clean out of their minds, heard the wailing of mothers who'd rather drown than live to see the new world. But Adana, she was fierce, powerful, strong. She had in her the blood of warriors, the spirit of the Mbundu people who'd fought the Portuguese slave traders for generations. Even when the ship finally docked in Charleston, even when she was dragged to the auction block half dead and trembling, her eyes still held fire. The old wise ones say that's why Elias Hawthorne bought her, not 'cause she was strong-backed for field work, but 'cause he wanted to break that defiant spirit, wanted to prove he could tame what God himself made wild. They brought her to Willow Bend in chains, heavy chains that left scars on her ankles she'd carry till her dying day. The plantation sprawled across more than 1,000 acres of Georgia red clay, cotton fields stretching far as the eye could see, white bowls shining under that cruel sun like false promises of comfort. At the center sat the big house, all white columns and arrogance, while we lived in the quarters. Rows of rough-hewn cabins with dirt floors, walls that couldn't keep out the cold or the heat, roofs that leaked when it rained. Adana was put to work in the fields, chopping cotton from can't-see morning till can't-see night. The overseer, a wicked soul named Thaddeus Crane, took pleasure in the whip, used it for every little thing and sometimes for nothing at all. Whipping for nothing just to hear us cry out, just to remind us we was property, not people. But at night, at night in the dark quarters when the white folks slept and the world belonged to shadows and whispers, Adana would gather the children round her and tell stories. Stories of the old country, of ancestors who danced free under African moons, of gods who punished the wicked and blessed the righteous. She spoke of Kalunga, the sea that carried the dead back home, and of spirits that never forgot their people. The elders warned her to be careful, Slaves caught teaching African ways could be sold off or worse. But Adana wouldn't be silenced. "They can chain my body," she'd say in her thick accent, her voice carrying the music of her homeland. "But they can't chain my memory. They can't chain what my mama taught me, what her mama taught her." It was in this world, suffering something terrible but refusing to die, that Adana met a man named Kofi. He'd been born in the Virginia tobacco fields, strong as iron, with hands scarred from years of hard labor. They fell for each other the way enslaved people did, quick and fierce, 'cause you never knew when the auction block might tear you apart. They jumped the broom in a secret ceremony under the full moon, with nothing but the night wind as witness and the ancestors as blessing. 9 months later, on a sweltering August night when the air sat so heavy you could barely breathe, Adana's water broke. The midwife, old Bessie, a woman who knew the ways of root work and healing, came running. There weren't no doctor for slaves, no fancy medicine, just old Bessie's gnarled hands and prayers to gods both African and Christian. "Push, child, push," Bessie commanded, her voice cutting through Adana's screams. The baby came in a rush of blood and fluid, slipping into old Bessie's waiting hands. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then the child let out a wail that seemed to shake the very walls of that cabin. "It's a girl," Bessie announced, holding up the squalling infant. "And Lord have mercy, look at them eyes." Even as a newborn, Maria's eyes held something special. They was dark as polished obsidian, deep as wells, and they seemed to see more than a baby should. The old ones say that children born with such eyes carry the sight, the ability to see between worlds, to commune with spirits, to know things that ain't been spoken. Kofi held his daughter with trembling hands, this man of iron reduced to tears by such a small thing. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She's perfect, and she's ours." But in the world of bondage, nothing stayed ours for long. Maria grew strong in her mama's arms, drinking in stories with her mother's milk. By the time she could walk, she knew the names of African gods her people had worshipped for thousands of years. By the time she could talk, she could sing spirituals in 3 languages: English, Portuguese scraps from the slave traders, and the Kimbundu her mama refused to forget. The plantation operated like a well-oiled machine of misery. Up before dawn, out to the fields, backs bent over cotton plants that cut your hands bloody. The driver, a black man named Samuel who'd sold his soul to survive, would crack his whip and holler, "Move faster, you lazy niggers. Massa wants his quota." And we'd pick faster, even though our fingers bled, even though our backs screamed, even though every bone in our bodies begged for rest. Maria was too young for field work in those early years, but she wasn't too young to see. She saw her daddy stumble in each night, exhausted to the bone. She saw her mama's hands cracked and bleeding from the cotton bolls. She saw children her age already bent-backed from labor, already hollow-eyed from hunger and fear. But she also saw resistance, small acts, everyday rebellion that kept the spirit alive. She saw field hands slow their work when the overseer wasn't looking. She saw women slip extra cornmeal to families with babies. She saw men carving secret symbols into barn posts, signs meant to confuse the paddy rollers, to guide runaways, to honor the ancestors. And she heard whispers. Oh, the whispers that traveled through the quarters like wind through wheat. Whispers about a man up in Virginia named Nat Turner who'd led a revolt, who'd killed white folks in their beds before they hunted him down. Whispers about the Underground Railroad, about conductors who helped slaves escape north to freedom. Whispers about conjure women who could curse a cruel master, about root doctors who knew how to make poison from common plants. Maria soaked it all in, this fierce child with obsidian eyes. She was only 5 years old when she first understood what slavery truly meant. The day her baby brother was born. His name was Joseph, and he came into the world during cotton-picking season, when everyone was needed in the fields. Adana had to work the day after giving birth, her body still bleeding, still torn. She wrapped Joseph against her chest and went out to the rows, picking with one hand while the other held her newborn. The overseer rode by on his horse, looking down at this woman who'd just given life. "That baby's crying too much," Thaddeus Crane said, cold as winter frost. "Shut him up or I'll give you something to really cry about." Adana's hands shook as she tried to quiet Joseph. But newborns cry when they need to. It's what God made them do. Crane didn't care about God's design. He dismounted, walked over, and before anyone could move, he grabbed Joseph from Adana's arms. "I said shut him up." What happened next, folks don't like to speak on even now. Crane shook that baby, shook him hard enough that his little neck snapped like a dry twig. Then he tossed the tiny body back at Adana like he was returning a broken tool. "Get back to work," he said, mounting his horse. "And next time you birth a brat, make sure it knows how to be quiet." The sound Adana made that day, it weren't human. It was the sound of a soul breaking, of a mother's heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. She fell to her knees in the red Georgia clay, holding her dead son, rocking back and forth, keening in a language older than slavery, older than America itself. Maria, watching from the edge of the field where she'd been playing with other children, saw everything. Her 5-year-old mind couldn't fully grasp what had happened, but her spirit knew. Her ancestors knew. The fire in her obsidian eyes, already burning bright, now blazed with a fury that would only grow stronger with each passing year. That night, Kofi buried his son in the slave cemetery, a plot of hard ground at the edge of the woods where we laid our dead with no markers. No prayers from white preachers, just our own words to guide spirits home. Adana couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop seeing her baby's broken body, couldn't stop hearing that terrible snap. Old Bessie came to their cabin bringing herbs to help Adana sleep, but she also brought something else, a small cloth bag, dark and mysterious. "Listen to me now," Bessie whispered, her old eyes gleaming in the firelight. "This here's a mojo bag. Inside's got grave dirt from your son's resting place, some high john root for strength, and gopher dust I made under the dark moon. You wear this round your neck and Joseph's spirit will watch over you. More than that, when the time comes for reckoning, his death won't be forgot. The ancestors keep an account, child. Every tear, every drop of blood. It all gets written in the book that can't be erased." Adana took the bag with shaking hands, tied it around her neck and never took it off. Maria, pretending to sleep on her pallet in the corner, watched and listened. Even at 5 years old, she understood. The white man's justice would never punish Thaddeus Crane for murdering a slave baby. But there was another kind of justice, older and deeper. The kind that lived in mojo bags and whispered prayers. The kind that waited patient as stone for the right moment to strike. 10 years would pass before that moment came. 10 years of suffering. 10 years of growing. 10 years of Maria transforming from a child into a young woman who carried vengeance in her heart like other girls carried flowers. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand what happened to Kofi, to Maria's daddy. 'Cause if Joseph's death planted the seed of rage in Maria's soul, what came next watered it with blood. Now you see, people, Maria was 10 years old when they took her daddy away. 10 years old and already carrying burdens that would crush most full-grown souls. She'd watched her baby brother die, watched her mama's spirit break and slowly piece itself back together with nothing but prayers and root work holding the cracks. She'd worked her first season in the cotton fields, learned how the bowls cut your fingers to ribbons, how the sun beat down till you felt your very brain cooking inside your skull. But Maria was different from other children born into bondage. She had her mama's fierce spirit, her daddy's iron strength, and something else. Something that made even the old wise ones whisper behind cupped hands. That sight, that ability to see beyond what regular folks could see. She'd wake some mornings claiming she'd talked to Joseph in her dreams, that he showed her things to come. She'd point to a field hand and say, "That man's time is short." And sure enough, within a week, he'd take sick and die. The conjure women recognized what she was, a child touched by the ancestors, marked for something bigger than survival. In them, days of deep sorrow, Willow Bend Plantation run like clockwork. Elias Hawthorne, the master, sat in his big house counting money made from our suffering, while his pale, sickly wife spent her days in bed complaining about the Georgia heat. Hawthorne was a hard man, cold-eyed and calculating, but he left the daily brutality to his overseer, Thaddeus Crane, and the driver, Samuel the betrayer. The plantation held near 200 souls in bondage, field hands, house slaves, skilled workers like the blacksmith and the carpenter. Breeding women kept for producing more property. Children worked as soon as they could walk. We lived in the quarters, them rough cabins that leaked when it rained and froze when winter came. We ate cornmeal and salt pork, maybe some greens if we was lucky. We worked till our bodies gave out, then got up the next day and did it all over again. But Lord have mercy, we also found ways to live. In the cracks between suffering, we built our own world. Sunday afternoons, if the master allowed it, we'd gather for ring shouts, dancing in circles, clapping hands, singing spirituals that carried coded messages about freedom. Wade in the water meant use the river to throw off the scent hounds. Follow the drinking gourd meant look to the North Star, find your way to freedom. The white folks thought we was just singing about Jesus, but the Underground Railroad conductors knew better. Maria learned to read that year, though it was illegal, though she could be whipped bloody or sold away if caught. There was a house slave named Thomas, an old man who'd been taught by his first master's children before they realized what they was doing. Thomas kept books he'd salvaged from the trash, torn pages, water-stained volumes the white folks had discarded. He hid them in a hollow tree near the slave cemetery, and on Sunday evenings when the overseer was drunk and the master was occupied, he'd teach any child brave enough to learn. Maria was the bravest. She'd slip away to that hollow tree, her heart beating like African drums in her chest, scared to death but more scared of staying ignorant. Thomas would pull out a crumbling Bible or a water-damaged almanac, and by firefly light, he'd point to letters. "This here's an A," he'd whisper, his gnarled finger trembling on the page. "Say it with me now." "A," Maria would repeat, her young voice hungry for knowledge the way her body was hungry for food. Week by week, month by month, she pieced together the mystery of written words. She learned that there was a whole world beyond Willow Bend, places where people walked free, where children went to school instead of cotton fields, where black folks could own land and businesses in their own bodies. The knowledge was like fire in her belly, burning away fear, leaving only determination. She made friends among the other young slaves, formed bonds that would matter later when the time came for action. There was Ruth, a girl her age with quick hands and a quicker mind, daughter of the plantation seamstress. There was Big Moses, a boy 3 years older who already had muscles like a full-grown man from working the cotton gin. There was little Sarah, only 8 but wise beyond her years, who'd inherited her grandmother's gift for root medicine and conjure. Together they whispered in the dark of the quarters, sharing dreams of freedom, passing along news that traveled the slave grapevine faster than any letter. They heard about runaways who'd made it north to Philadelphia and Boston. They heard about Harriet Tubman, that fierce woman they called Moses, who kept coming back south to lead more people to freedom, had a price on her head but couldn't be caught. They heard about Denmark Vesey's planned uprising in Charleston, how it had been betrayed, but how the spirit of it lived on, burning bright in the hearts of enslaved folks all across the South. And they heard about Nat Turner. Sweet Jesus, how they heard about Nat Turner. That was the name that made white folks tremble and black folks stand a little taller, even in chains. A preacher slave who'd had visions, who'd gathered followers, who'd risen up in Virginia, and killed near 60 white people before the militia hunted him down. The retribution had been terrible. Hundreds of innocent black folks murdered in revenge. Turner himself hanged and skinned. His flesh distributed as souvenirs to white people who wanted trophies of their victory. But the fear remained. The knowledge that we could fight back, that we wasn't just docile beasts of burden, that we had teeth and claws and the willingness to use them. That knowledge couldn't be whipped out or hanged or burned away. Maria soaked it all in like dry ground drinks rain. By the time she turned 12, she could read better than most white folks, could write her name and the names of her ancestors, could recite spirituals and work songs and stories from the old country. Her hands was scarred from cotton picking. Her back bore the marks of the overseer's whip. She'd been beaten for talking back, for working too slow, for looking too proud, but her spirit remained unbroken. That's when Kofi's troubles started getting worse. See, her daddy was a strong-willed man, couldn't help but show defiance even when it cost him dear. He'd been whipped more times than anyone could count for small infractions, not moving fast enough, questioning the driver's orders, defending another slave from unfair punishment. But he kept his head up, kept his dignity, and that vexed the white folks something terrible. "That uppity buck needs breaking," Thaddeus Crane would say, chewing his tobacco and spitting brown streams into the Georgia dust. "Acts like he's better than what he is." Crane started assigning Kofi the hardest tasks, putting him to work clearing stumps from new fields, breaking ground so hard it could turn a steel plow, hauling stones till his back nearly broke. But Kofi did the work, did it without complaining, did it with a quiet strength that infuriated his tormentors more than any outburst could. Then came the summer Maria turned 10, the summer of the worst drought in 20 years. The cotton plants withered in the fields. The well water turned low and brackish. Tempers grew as hot as the blazing sun. Hawthorne was losing money, and when rich men lose money, it's always the poor what pay the price. The master called a meeting of all the slaves one Sunday morning, made us stand in the yard under that burning sun while he delivered his pronouncement. "Times is hard," Hawthorne announced from the porch of the big house, his face red from heat and whiskey. "Cotton prices is down and I got expenses to cover, so I'll be selling off some of you to make ends meet. The auction's in 2 weeks. You best pray I don't pick you." A collective shudder ran through the quarters that night. Families held each other tighter, knowing that in 2 weeks some of them would be torn apart forever. Mothers wept over children they might never see again. Men held wives they might lose to some distant plantation or worse, to the slave-breeding farms where women was treated like livestock. Maria watched her parents cling to each other in the firelight of their cabin, saw the fear in their eyes, felt her own heart clench with dread. But she was young, still valuable for future labor. Surely they wouldn't sell her. It was the older ones, the ones past prime working age or the ones like Kofi who'd proven too defiant, who faced the auction block. For 2 weeks, the plantation held its breath. Then the day came. The slave trader arrived in a wagon, a fat white man with cold eyes and breath that stank of rot-gut whiskey. Hawthorne walked through the quarters, pointing at people like they was cattle. "That one and that one, those two there." When his finger pointed at Kofi, Adana's cry could be heard across the entire plantation. "No, please, massa, please don't take my husband." Hawthorne didn't even look at her. "Shut your mouth, gal, unless you want to go with him." They chained Kofi with 10 other men, shackled ankle to ankle, wrist to wrist. Maria ran to her father, grabbed hold of his waist, screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, don't go." Kofi looked down at his daughter, this fierce child with obsidian eyes now streaming with tears, and somehow found the strength to smile. "You listen to me, Maria. You listen good. You're stronger than these chains. You're stronger than this bondage. You got African blood in you, warrior blood. Don't you never let them break you, you hear? Don't you never let them win." The trader's whip cracked across Kofi's back. "No talking." They dragged him away. Maria watched through blurred vision as her father was loaded onto that wagon, watched as he looked back one last time, watched until the dust from the wagon wheels settled and he was gone. Gone to Louisiana sugarcane fields, folks would later say. Gone to a hell even worse than Willow Bend, where men worked in poisonous heat, where the death rate was so high they had to keep buying new slaves to replace the ones who died. Maria never saw him again. That night something changed in her. The tears stopped. The grief hardened into something cold and sharp. She sat in the cabin while Adana rocked back and forth, keening in that old African way. And Maria felt the fire in her belly grow hotter, felt the rage take root and spread like poison ivy through her veins. She looked at the mojo bag around her mama's neck, the one that held grave dirt from Joseph's resting place, and she made a silent vow. One day somehow she'd make them pay. the overseer who killed her brother, the master who sold her father. The whole system of bondage that treated her people like property instead of souls. Old Bessie must have sensed something in the girl that night, because she came to the cabin carrying more than just herbs for grief. She brought a small iron nail, rusted and bent. "Child," she whispered, pressing the nail into Maria's palm. "This here come from a coffin. It's got power. You keep it close, you remember what they done, and when the time comes, and it will come sure as sunrise, you'll know what to do with all that rage burning inside you." Maria closed her fingers around the nail, felt its rough edge bite into her skin. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just nodded. In the days that followed, she worked harder than ever in the fields, kept her head down, her face neutral. But inside, oh inside, she was changing. Learning, planning. She listened to every whisper about runaways and revolts. She memorized every story of resistance. She watched Thaddeus Crane with eyes that saw not a man, but a target. She watched Elias Hawthorne with a hatred so pure it felt like prayer. And she kept reading, kept learning, sneaking to that hollow tree whenever she could. Because she understood now what she hadn't before. Knowledge was a weapon. Words were power. Understanding the enemy's world, their laws, their weakness, that was how you struck back. Not just with muscle and fury, though those had their place, but with cunning and patience and the kind of long-term planning that separated rebellion from suicide. The other young slaves noticed the change in her. Ruth would watch Maria's face in the firelight of the quarters and shiver, seeing something there that hadn't been there before. Big Moses started deferring to her in their whispered conversations, recognizing a natural leader emerging from the ashes of a broken child. Little Sarah brought her conjure woman grandmother to meet Maria, and the old woman took one look at those obsidian eyes and declared, "This one's been touched by the crossroads. She's walking between worlds now." By age 12, Maria was no longer just another slave girl picking cotton. She was becoming something else, a spark that might one day catch and spread, a seed of rebellion taking root in hostile soil. But she was also still a child in a world that showed no mercy to weakness. And Elias Hawthorne, that cold-eyed master, had noticed her too. Noticed how she held herself different, how other slaves seemed to look to her, how her eyes blazed with intelligence and defiance that no amount of whipping could extinguish. "That girl," he said to Thaddeus Crane one evening, watching Maria walk past the big house with a water bucket balanced on her head, spine straight as a pine tree. "She's got the look of trouble about her, just like her daddy did." Crane spat tobacco juice and grinned, showing brown teeth. "Want me to break her, boss? I'm good at breaking high-spirited fillies." Hawthorne considered, his pale eyes calculating. "Not yet. She's young still, might prove useful if we train her right. But keep watch on her, and if she steps out of line..." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but the threat was clear. Maria felt their eyes on her, felt the danger gathering like storm clouds. But she didn't break stride, didn't show fear. She kept walking, kept that water bucket perfectly balanced, kept her face as still as carved wood. But inside, her heart was pounding. Inside, she was counting days, collecting grievances, preparing for something she couldn't yet name, but could feel approaching like thunder in the distance. The ancestors was watching. The spirits was gathering. And in the dark quarters at night, when Maria lay on her hard pallet and gripped that coffin nail till it left marks on her palm, she could almost hear them whispering, "Soon, child. Not yet, but soon. Your time is coming. The reckoning is coming." And she believed them, because belief was all she had left, and she'd learned from her mama and old Bessie that sometimes belief was the strongest weapon of all. Listen here now, because what I'm about to tell you happened 3 years after they tore Kofi away from his family. 3 years of Maria growing harder and sharper like a blade being forged in fire. She was 13 years old when the news came that would push her past the edge of caution into the territory of blood and retribution. 13 years old, already a woman in body if not in years. already carrying more sorrow than most folks accumulate in a lifetime. In them days of deep sorrow, Willow Bend Plantation operated under the iron fist of Elias Hawthorne's greed. The master had expanded his holdings, bought more land, acquired more slaves, built his cotton empire on the broken backs of people he considered less than human. His wife had finally died. Consumption took her slow and painful. And within 6 months he'd married again. This time a young woman from Charleston society named Constance, barely older than Maria herself, all pale skin and nervous hands and eyes that couldn't meet the gaze of the slaves she now owned. Adana had aged terribly in them 3 years. The loss of Joseph, the selling of Kofi, the endless labor in fields that stretched from horizon to horizon. It had bent her spirit near to breaking. But she kept going, 'cause that's what we did. We survived. We endured. We carried on even when every bone in our bodies screamed for rest. Even when our hearts was so heavy, we could barely draw breath. Maria watched her mama waste away slow, watched the light dim in eyes that had once blazed with African fire, and the rage in her own heart grew darker, deeper, more dangerous. She was no longer the child who cried when her daddy was dragged away. She was something else now, something the old wise ones recognized and feared in equal measure. Old Bessie had taken Maria under her wing proper, teaching her the ways of root work and conjure, when the moon hung dark in the sky and the quarters was silent as a grave. "You got the sight, child," Bessie would whisper, her ancient hands sorting through dried herbs and mysterious powders in the dim candlelight. "You touched by the crossroads, marked by the ancestors. But that kind of power, it comes with a price. You use it careless. You use it for wickedness, and it'll turn on you like a snake what's been cornered." Maria learned which roots could heal and which could kill. She learned that Jimson weed could make a man see visions that'd drive him mad. She learned that pokeweed berries, crushed just right, could poison someone slow enough that it'd look like natural sickness. She learned the old African prayers, the calls to spirits that predated Christianity by thousands of years, the words that could open doors between this world and the next. She was careful, though, patient, biding her time like a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She kept picking cotton, kept her head down during the day, kept her face as blank as a wooden mask when Thaddeus Crane rode past on his horse, whip coiled at his belt like a sleeping serpent. But at night, oh Lord, at night she was studying, reading every scrap of paper she could find, learning about poisons from an old herbal medicine book Thomas had salvaged from the trash, memorizing which plants grew wild in the Georgia woods and what they could do to human flesh. The other young slaves knew something was brewing. Ruth would catch Maria staring at the big house with such intensity it made her skin crawl. Big Moses started bringing her information. When the overseer was drunk, when the master was traveling, when the patrollers made their rounds. Little Sarah's grandmother declared Maria was walking a dangerous path, one that led either to freedom or to a grave, with no middle ground between. Then came the day that changed everything, the day Maria overheard what she was never meant to hear. It was a sticky August afternoon, the kind where the air sits so heavy you feel like you're drowning in it, even standing still. Maria had been sent to the big house to help in the kitchen. The regular cook had taken sick, and they needed extra hands to prepare dinner for Master Hawthorne and some visiting planters from Alabama. She was supposed to stay in the kitchen, but she heard voices in the dining room, heard her mama's name spoken, and something made her creep close to the door, made her press her ear against the wood, despite knowing the punishment for eavesdropping could be severe. "That breeding wench Adana," she heard Hawthorne saying, his voice casual as if discussing livestock. "She's past her prime for field work, but she's still got some value. Caldwell here runs a breeding farm down in Alabama, specializes in producing strong stock." Another voice, thick with whiskey and self-satisfaction. "I'll give you a fair price, Hawthorne. We treat our breeding wenches well. Good food, light work, comfortable quarters. Of course, they're expected to produce regularly. I got a stable of prime bucks that'll service them proper." Laughter, male laughter, comfortable and cruel. Discussing Maria's mama like she was a brood mare. not a human being who'd already suffered more than any soul should have to bear. "She's produced before," Hawthorne continued. "2 live births that I know of. One died as a baby, the other's working my fields now. Girl named Maria got a rebellious streak, but she'll break eventually. They all do." "Well then, it's settled. I'll take the woman off your hands next month when I come through on my buying trip. What about the daughter? Breeding age yet?" "Just about. I'm considering my options with that one. Might keep her, might sell her separate. Haven't decided." Maria's hands clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. Her vision went red at the edges, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. They was gonna sell her mama to a breeding farm, gonna reduce Adana to nothing but a body for producing more slaves, more property, more merchandise for white men to profit from. And they was discussing Maria herself like she was a heifer ready for market. Something broke inside her at that moment. Not her spirit, Lord, no. Her spirit was stronger than ever. What broke was her patience, her caution, her willingness to wait for the right time. The right time was now. Had to be now, before they shipped Adana away, before they destroyed what little family Maria had left. She slipped back to the kitchen, her mind racing faster than a runaway's heartbeat. The cook, a house slave named Dinah, was preparing the master's favorite dish, roasted chicken with herbs and vegetables. Maria watched those herbs being chopped, watched the meal being assembled, and a plan formed in her mind like storm clouds gathering. That night, after the dinner had been served and the dishes cleared, after she'd been dismissed back to the quarters, Maria didn't go to her cabin. Instead, she crept through the darkness to the edge of the woods where certain plants grew wild. She knew exactly what she was looking for: pokeweed, identifiable even in the dark by its distinctive leaves and purple-black berries. She picked the berries careful, wrapped them in a scrap of cloth, whispered a prayer to the ancestors asking for strength and guidance. Then she waited, hidden in the shadows, watching the big house until all the lights went out, until even the master and his young wife had retired for the night. The kitchen door was never locked. Why would it be? Slaves weren't supposed to have the courage to sneak into white folks' spaces, weren't supposed to have the audacity to resist. But Maria had courage burning in her like wildfire, had audacity inherited from warriors who'd fought slave traders on African soil. She slipped inside silent as smoke, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The kitchen was dark save for the dying embers in the hearth, casting just enough light for her to see. She found where Dinah kept the master's breakfast supplies, found the jar of honey he liked in his morning tea, found the cornmeal for his Johnny cakes. Her hands trembled as she crushed the pokeweed berries, as she mixed the poison into the honey, stirred it careful so no trace of purple remained visible. Not enough to kill immediately. She'd learned from old Bessie that slow poison was smarter, harder to trace, just enough to make him sick, to make him suffer, to give her mama time to what, escape? Hide? There was no safe place for a runaway slave woman in Georgia. But Maria wasn't thinking clearly. She was thinking with rage, with grief, with the accumulated suffering of 13 years of bondage and brutality. She was thinking about Joseph's broken body, about Kofi's face as they dragged him away, about her mama being reduced to breeding stock for some Alabama planter's profit. She was almost finished, almost had the honey jar sealed back up when the door creaked open behind her. Her heart stopped. She spun around, the jar still in her hands, guilt written all over her face. It was Thaddeus Crane, the overseer. He must have been out late drinking, must have come to the kitchen for a midnight snack. He stood there swaying slightly, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and then he saw her, saw the jar, saw her frozen expression of terror and defiance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Crane's face split into a terrible smile. "Well, well, well," he slurred, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. "What do we got here? Little uppity Maria, sneaking around in Massa's kitchen in the dead of night. What you got there, gal?" Maria's mind raced. She could lie, could claim she was just hungry, could try to talk her way out. But Crane was already walking toward her, already reaching for the jar. Let me see that. He snatched it from her hands, held it up to the dying firelight, squinted at the contents. This the master's honey. What you doing with the master's honey, girl? Then his eyes widened. He'd seen something, a trace of purple, a berry seed that hadn't fully dissolved. His face went from confusion to understanding to fury in the space of a heartbeat. You tried to poison him, he whispered, almost in awe at the audacity of it. You stupid, crazy little nigger bitch. You tried to poison Massa Hawthorne. He grabbed Maria by the throat, slammed her against the wall so hard her vision went starry. They're gonna hang you for this. Gonna make an example of you that'll have every slave on this plantation too scared to even think about resistance. But first, I'm gonna beat you till you can't stand, till you can't even remember your own name. Maria clawed at his hands, gasping for air, her feet kicking uselessly. This was it. This was the end. She'd failed her mama, failed herself, and now she'd die without even achieving her revenge. But Crane didn't call for help immediately. He was drunk enough, mean enough to want to deliver some punishment himself first. He dragged Maria outside, across the yard toward the whipping post that stood like a monument to cruelty between the big house and the quarters. She fought him every step, screaming now, not caring who heard. Let them all hear. Let them all wake up and see what was happening. And they did. Cabin doors opened. Faces appeared in the darkness. Adana came running, still in her nightdress, her face twisted with horror. Let her go. Please let my baby go. Crane backhanded Adana without even looking at her, sent her sprawling in the dirt. Then he tied Maria to the whipping post, her hands stretched above her head, her back exposed. By now, Hawthorne had emerged from the big house, holding a lantern, his young wife cowering behind him. Other slaves were gathering too, forced to watch, because that's what public punishments was for, to terrify the rest into submission. This gal, Crane announced, breathing hard from exertion and excitement, tried to poison Massa Hawthorne. I caught her red-handed in the kitchen tampering with his food. The penalty for that is death, but I think she needs some education first. Hawthorne stepped forward, his face cold and calculating in the lamplight. He looked at Maria, at this girl who'd grown from a defiant child into a young woman who dared to strike back. Attempted murder of a white man, he said quietly. That's a capital crime. I could have you hanged right now, girl. Would be within my legal rights. Maria lifted her head, met his eyes despite the terror coursing through her veins. You gonna sell my mama to a breeding farm, she said, her voice shaking but clear. You gonna treat her like an animal. Well, we ain't animals, we people. And people fight back. A murmur ran through the gathered slaves. Adana was weeping, Big Moses looked stricken, Ruth had her hands over her mouth in horror. But Maria saw something else too. She saw pride in some eyes, saw recognition, saw the flicker of rebellion that her defiance had sparked. Hawthorne's expression didn't change. I've been too lenient with you uppity ones, he said. That ends now. Crane, you wanted to break her? Well, I'm giving you permission, but not with the whip. I got something better in mind, something that'll break her body and her spirit both, something that'll serve as a warning to every slave on this plantation about what happens when you forget your place. He turned to address the gathered slaves, his voice carrying across the yard. Tomorrow, we're gonna construct a special punishment for this girl. Something that'll teach her, and all of you, a lesson you'll never forget. Maria's blood ran cold. Whatever he had planned, it was worse than whipping, worse than hanging. She could see it in his eyes, in the terrible satisfaction spreading across his face. And she was right, because what Elias Hawthorne had in mind was the tronco, the trunk, a hollowed oak log half buried in the ground, where she'd be chained for 60 days and 60 nights, exposed to sun and rain and the mockery of everyone who passed. But that's the next part of the story, child. That's where the real suffering and the real transformation begins. Now listen here, people, 'cause what happened next was cruelty in its purest form. Evil so calculated it could only come from a heart that had long since turned to stone. The sun rose that morning over Willow Bend Plantation like it was just another day, like the world hadn't shifted on its axis the night before, like a 13-year-old girl wasn't about to be subjected to punishment that'd make the devil himself weep. Hawthorne had Maria kept tied to the whipping post all night, her arms stretched above her head till they went numb, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her body exposed to the August heat that lingered even in darkness. Mosquitoes feasted on her skin, leaving welts that itched and burned. She couldn't sit, couldn't rest, could only stand there suffering while the plantation slept around her. Though Lord knows, not many folks in the quarters got much sleep that night. Adana stayed near as she dared, kneeling in the dirt just beyond where the overseer would chase her away, praying in that old African tongue she'd never fully forgotten, calling on gods whose names predated the Christian God by millennia. Old Bessie snuck out once, risked a beating to press a small mojo bag into Maria's bound hands, whispering words of power and protection before Crane spotted her and drove her back with curses and threats. When dawn broke, painting the Georgia sky in shades of blood and gold, Hawthorne emerged from the big house already dressed for the day's work, already planning the spectacle he intended to create. His young wife Constance stood on the porch in her nightgown, pale and frightened, but he paid her no mind. She was decoration, nothing more, another possession like his slaves and his land and his cotton gin. "Gather everyone," Hawthorne ordered Crane. "Every slave on this plantation. I want them all to see this. Ring the bell." The plantation bell clanged loud and insistent, the sound that usually called us to work now summoning us to witness punishment. Field hands came trudging from their cabins. House slaves emerged from the big house. Even the children were dragged out to watch. Near 200 souls assembled in the yard between the big house and the quarters, forming a semicircle around the whipping post where Maria still hung. Some looked at her with pity, some with fear, some with that carefully blank expression slaves learned to wear to survive. But a few, Ruth, Big Moses, little Sarah and her conjure woman grandmother, looked at her with something else. Pride, maybe. Recognition that she'd dared to fight back, even knowing the cost. Hawthorne climbed onto a wooden platform they used for auction days, when new slaves arrived or old ones got sold off. He looked down at his assembled property with cold blue eyes that held no more warmth than a January frost. "Let this be a lesson," he began, his voice carrying across the yard. "I have been a fair master. I feed you, clothe you, provide shelter for your worthless hides. I allow you your Sunday gatherings, your superstitious practices, your primitive songs. I work you hard, yes, but that's the natural order. You're beasts of burden, created by God to serve your betters." A pause. Some of the older slaves nodded, had heard this speech or variations of it 100 times before. The younger ones, the ones like Maria who still had fire in their bellies, clenched their fists and kept their faces neutral. "But there's always a few who forget their place," Hawthorne continued, his gaze settling on Maria, "who get ideas above their station, who dare to raise their hands, or their poison, against white folks. This girl here, this ungrateful wench, tried to kill me last night, snuck into my kitchen like a thief, tampered with my food, intended to murder me in my own home." A collective intake of breath from the assembled slaves. Some hadn't heard the details, had only caught whispers and rumors. Now they knew, and the fear was palpable, thick enough to taste. "The law says I can hang her for this," Hawthorne said. "Stretch her neck until she kicks and twitches and finally goes still. Would be within my rights, but I'm a merciful man." His smile was anything but merciful. "So instead, I'm going to teach her a lesson. Teach all of you a lesson. Show you what happens when slaves forget their place and imagine themselves equal to their masters." He gestured to Crane, who grinned like a wolf spotting wounded prey. "Bring out the trunk." 4 strong field hands, forced to participate in their sister's punishment, carried out a massive oak log, easily 8 feet long and hollowed out like a canoe. They'd been working on it all night under Crane's supervision, had carved out the interior just deep enough to hold a human body, had drilled holes for chains and iron bands. The sight of it made several women gasp. The old ones recognized what it was, had heard stories from other plantations about this particular form of torture. It was called the tronco in some places, the punishment log in others. A wooden coffin for the living, designed to immobilize and humiliate, to break body and spirit through prolonged suffering. They dug a hole near the quarters, deep enough that the trunk would be half buried when they set it in, making it impossible for the prisoner to tip over or escape. The red Georgia clay was hard as concrete from the drought, but they dug anyway, sweat pouring off them, while Maria watched with mounting horror. This was worse than hanging. Hanging would be quick, would be over in minutes. This was torture designed to last, to inflict maximum suffering over maximum time. When the hole was ready, Hawthorne nodded to Crane. "Strip her and put her in." Maria fought then, fought like a cornered wildcat, screaming and kicking as Crane and two other overseers dragged her from the whipping post. They tore off her dress, left her naked and exposed in front of 200 witnesses. The humiliation deliberate, calculated to strip away dignity along with clothing. Adana broke free from the crowd, ran toward her daughter. "No, please, Massa, take me instead. Punish me, not her. She's just a child. She don't know what she doing." Crane backhanded Adana so hard she went down in the dirt, blood streaming from her split lip. Maria screamed her mama's name, fury and anguish mixing in her voice. They forced Maria into the hollowed trunk, making her lie on her back with her head and feet sticking out either end. Her arms were pinned inside, crossed over her chest like a corpse prepared for burial. Iron bands were fitted over the trunk and bolted shut, trapping her inside. Heavy chains were wrapped around it and padlocked, ensuring she couldn't possibly escape. Then they lowered the trunk into the hole, buried it halfway so she couldn't rock or roll, couldn't do anything but lie there with her head exposed to the elements at one end, her feet sticking out the other. A small opening had been cut near her head so she could breathe, so she wouldn't suffocate. Hawthorne wanted her to survive this, wanted the punishment to last. Maria lay there panting, her body already cramping from the unnatural position, terror and rage warring in her chest. The trunk pressed against her from all sides, a wooden cage that felt like being buried alive while still breathing. Hawthorne stood over her, looking down at her exposed face with clinical interest. 60 days, he announced. 2 full months you'll stay in there. You'll be fed once a day. Slop, barely enough to keep you alive. You'll drink rainwater when it falls or go thirsty. You'll shit and piss yourself like the animal you are, and everyone who passes will see you, will remember what happens to uppity niggers who forget their place. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Maria could hear. And when those 60 days are done, if you survive them, I'm selling your mama to Caldwell's breeding farm anyway. So all this suffering, it's for nothing. You failed, girl. You failed. And now you pay the price. He straightened, addressing the crowd again. Anyone who helps her, brings her extra food, extra water, shows her any kindness at all, will join her in punishment. Anyone who speaks to her except to mock and revile her will be whipped. She is to be shunned, treated as an example of what rebellion brings. Is that understood? A murmured, "Yes, Massa," rippled through the assembled slaves. Good. Now get back to work. Cotton won't pick itself, and we've wasted enough time on this foolishness already. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, casting glances back at Maria as they went. Some looked away quickly, unable to bear the sight. Others stared with morbid fascination, already wondering if she'd survive the first week, let alone 2 months. Adana had to be dragged away, still crying, still begging. Big Moses was pushed toward the fields with the other men, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to crack. Ruth and little Sarah were herded back to their work, but not before Sarah's grandmother made a subtle sign in the air, a blessing, a ward, a promise that the ancestors were watching. And then Maria was alone. Alone in her wooden coffin, the sun already climbing higher, the heat building, the first flies beginning to buzz around her exposed head and feet. The first hour was the worst. That initial shock of realization that this was real, this was happening, this was her new reality. She tried to move, to shift position, but the trunk held her immobile. She tried to scream, but her voice was already hoarse from the night before. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come, choked off by rage and despair. By midday, the sun was a hammer beating down on her exposed face, baking her skin, making her skull feel like it was cracking open from the heat. Sweat poured off her, pooled beneath her in the trunk, turning the interior slick and foul. Her mouth went dry, her tongue swelling, her lips cracking. Crane came by in the afternoon, chewing tobacco and grinning. He squatted down beside her head, spat brown juice that splattered near her face. "How you feeling, gal? Comfortable?" He laughed at his own joke. "This is just day one. You got 59 more to go. Think you gonna make it?" Maria refused to answer, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She stared up at the sky, at the clouds drifting past, and tried to remember her mama's stories about ancestors who'd endured the Middle Passage, who'd survived horrors beyond imagining. If they could survive the belly of slave ships, she told herself, I can survive this. If they could endure the auction block and the whip, and the separation from everyone they loved, I can endure this trunk. But as the first day wore into evening, as the sun finally set and the temperature dropped, as the mosquitoes descended in swarms to feed on her helpless body, Maria felt her resolve beginning to crack. This wasn't just physical torture. It was designed to break the mind, to reduce a human being to a whimpering animal begging for death. That night, lying in darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand if she could have moved it, Maria heard footsteps approaching. She tensed, expecting Crane or Hawthorne coming to taunt her again. But it was Adana's voice that whispered from the darkness, so quiet Maria almost thought she'd imagined it. "Baby girl, I'm here. Can't touch you, can't help you, but I'm here. You ain't alone, you hear me? You ain't never alone." And then fainter, more voices. Other slaves defying Hawthorne's orders, risking punishment to stand silent witness in the darkness. They couldn't free her, couldn't ease her suffering, but they could bear witness. They could remember. They could refuse to let her disappear into this torture alone. Maria's eyes filled with tears then, the first she'd shed since being put in the trunk. Not tears of despair, but tears of something else. Gratitude, connection, the knowledge that even in the deepest hell, she was still part of a community. Still loved, still human, despite everything designed to strip that humanity away. And in that moment, chained in a wooden coffin half buried in Georgia dirt, 13-year-old Maria made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would endure every day of those 60 days. And when it was over, when they finally pulled her from this trunk, she would make them pay. Not just Hawthorne and Crane, but the whole system of bondage that made such cruelty possible. She would survive, and she would have her reckoning. The ancestors whispered their agreement in the night wind. The spirits of those who died in chains promised their support. And somewhere, across the ocean in the African homeland her mama had been stolen from, the old gods heard her vow and smiled their terrible smiles. Day one ended. 59 more to go. But Maria do Tronco, the girl who would be chained to the trunk, was already becoming something more than just a slave girl. She was becoming a legend, a warning, a promise of retribution that no amount of chains could contain. Now you see, people, them first days in the trunk was like descending through the circles of hell itself, each one bringing new torment, new understanding of how deep human cruelty could go when one person owned another like property. Maria lay there in that wooden coffin, half buried in Georgia red clay, and learned things about suffering that no child should ever have to know. Day two brought the sun again, that merciless August sun that climbed the sky like a slow-burning fire, turning the air thick and heavy as wet wool. The heat built gradual at first, almost gentle in the early morning, but by midday it was pure torture. The wood of the trunk absorbed that heat, became an oven baking Maria's trapped flesh. She couldn't move to escape it, couldn't shift to find relief, could only lie there as her skin blistered and her brain felt like it was melting inside her skull. The thirst was worse than the heat, though. Lord have mercy. The thirst was something terrible. Her tongue swelled in her mouth, thick and dry as old leather. Her lips cracked and bled, the taste of copper mixing with the dust that settled on her face. She'd been given water once, a dipperful poured into her mouth by Crane, who made sure to spill half of it deliberately, laughing as she choked and gasped. "That's your ration for the day, gal," he'd said, tobacco juice staining his teeth brown. "Better hope it rains soon, else you gonna know what real thirst feels like." But it didn't rain. The drought that had plagued Georgia that summer continued unbroken, the sky staying clear and pitiless blue, not a cloud in sight to offer shade or moisture. Maria stared up at that empty sky and remembered her mama's stories about Kalunga, the great water that separated the living from the dead, and she wondered if she was already crossing it, already dying slow in this wooden boat that would never reach any shore. The cramping started on day 3. Her body, forced into an unnatural position with no way to stretch or shift, began to rebel. Muscles seized and knotted, sending lightning bolts of agony through her limbs. Her back felt like it was breaking. Her shoulders screamed from being pinned in place. Her legs went numb and then burned with pins and needles when circulation returned. She wanted to scream, wanted to cry out for mercy, for relief, for death. But she remembered Hawthorne's cruel smile, remembered his promise that this suffering was meant to break her, and she clamped her jaw shut. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She wouldn't let them see her break, no matter how much it hurt. Field hands passed by on their way to and from the cotton fields, forced to walk past her trunk, forced to see what happened to those who resisted. Most kept their eyes down, couldn't bear to look, but a few glanced at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Pity, yes, but also something else. Fear, maybe, or anger, or that dangerous spark of rebellion that her act had ignited. Hawthorne came daily, like clockwork, to inspect his handiwork. He'd stand over her, blocking the sun briefly, a moment of blessed shade that she hated herself for being grateful for, and speak in that cold, measured voice. "How are we feeling today, Maria? Learning our lesson yet? Ready to beg forgiveness and promise to be a good, obedient slave from now on?" The first few days she didn't answer, didn't even look at him. But on day 4, when the pain was so intense she could barely think straight, she made the mistake of meeting his eyes. "I ain't begging you for nothing," she croaked, her voice barely recognizable, raw from thirst and screaming in the night when she thought no one could hear. "I ain't broken yet." Hawthorne smiled, pleased. "Good. I'd be disappointed if you gave up so easily. Breaking you slow is much more satisfying than breaking you quick." He dropped something near her head, a piece of cornbread, fresh and still warm. The smell of it made her stomach clench with hunger so fierce it was painful. She'd been fed slop once a day, barely enough to keep a dog alive, let alone a growing girl. That cornbread smelled like heaven itself. "Go ahead," Hawthorne said. "Eat it. All you gotta do is beg. Say, 'Please, massa, I'm sorry for trying to poison you. I'm just a worthless nigger who forgot her place.' Say that, and the cornbread's yours." Maria stared at that bread, her mouth watering despite her thirst, her belly crying out for sustenance. It would be so easy, just words, just a few words to end this particular torture, to fill her stomach, to show submission. But she turned her head away, closed her eyes. "I'd rather starve," she whispered. She heard Hawthorne's intake of breath, sharp with surprise and something that might have been reluctant admiration. Then the sound of his boots walking away, the cornbread left there to rot in the sun where she could smell it but not reach it. Torture of a different kind. That night, her 4th night in the trunk, and the rain finally came. Not a gentle rain, but a violent thunderstorm that rolled across Georgia like an invading army, lightning splitting the sky, thunder shaking the ground. The first drops hit her face like bullets, cold and shocking after days of burning heat. Maria opened her mouth, desperate to catch the water, to ease her terrible thirst. But the rain came too fast, too hard, choking her when she tried to drink, filling her nose and ears, turning the trunk into a pool that threatened to drown her. She coughed and sputtered, turning her head to keep from drowning, managing to swallow some water but losing most of it. The storm lasted hours, soaking her completely, chilling her to the bone after days of heat. Her teeth chattered, her body shook with cold, and she realized the trunk had new tortures to offer. Not just heat and thirst, but cold and wet, the cycle of suffering endless and varied. When the storm finally passed, leaving her shivering and miserable, she heard singing. Soft at first, so soft she thought she was imagining it. But then it grew stronger, multiple voices joining together in a spiritual she recognized from Sunday gatherings. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. It was coming from the quarters, from her people, singing loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough that the white folks in the big house might not notice. It was defiance disguised as worship, solidarity wrapped in prayer. They were telling her she wasn't alone, that they remembered her, that her suffering mattered. Maria's eyes filled with tears that mixed with the rainwater on her face. She tried to sing along, but her voice was too weak, too damaged. So she just listened. Let the music wash over her like a baptism. Let it remind her that she was still human, still part of a community, still loved despite everything. By day 7, her body had begun to adapt in terrible ways. Her skin, blistered from sun and rain, had hardened into angry red patches. Her muscles, though still cramping, had found a kind of numb acceptance of their position. Her mind had started to drift, to separate from the physical suffering, to float away to places where there was no trunk, no plantation, no chains. Old Bessie had warned her about this, had told her stories of slaves who'd survived similar punishments by letting their spirits travel while their bodies endured. The body can take more than the mind thinks possible, Bessie had said, long as the spirit finds somewhere else to go. Maria let her spirit wander. She visited her daddy in Louisiana, saw him working those sugarcane fields, imagined him still alive and strong. She visited baby Joseph in the slave cemetery, saw him playing with other children who died too young, all of them free now in whatever lay beyond. She visited Africa, the homeland she'd never seen but carried in her blood, walked on soil her ancestors had walked, spoke languages she'd never learned but somehow understood. But she always came back, always returned to the trunk, to the suffering, to the reality that couldn't be escaped no matter how far her spirit traveled. On day 8, Thaddeus Crane brought visitors. 3 other plantation owners from neighboring counties come to see Hawthorne's innovative method of slave discipline. They stood around Maria's trunk like she was livestock at a fair, discussing her condition with clinical interest. "Remarkable," one said, a fat man with a red face and whiskey breath. "How long you planning to keep her like this?" 60 days total, Hawthorne replied, "though I'm curious to see if she'll last that long. Lost one this way a few years back, died around day 40 from fever." "Shame to lose good property," another commented. "She breeding age yet?" "Just about. If she survives, I'm considering selling her. Too much trouble to keep around, even broken." They discussed her future like she couldn't hear them, like she was already dead or might as well be. Maria listened with half her attention, while the other half counted heartbeats, measured breaths, tracked the movement of ants across the ground near her head. Anything to stay sane, to keep her mind occupied, to avoid the madness that lurked at the edges of consciousness. That night, on her 8th night in the trunk, she heard footsteps approaching again. Different from the usual sounds of the plantation, more cautious, more purposeful. Then a young voice, barely a whisper. "Miss Maria?" "It's me, Josiah, from the big house." Maria's eyes flew open. Josiah was the 10-year-old house slave who served meals, who swept floors, who was invisible to white folks the way young black children often were. She'd seen him around but never spoken to him much. "I brought you something," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Water and a bit of bread. I know Massa said not to help you, but it ain't right what they doing. You was brave trying to fight back. Someone got to help you." He tipped water into her mouth, careful and slow so she wouldn't choke. Then he broke off pieces of bread and fed them to her, his small hands shaking with fear but steady in their purpose. "Why you helping me?" Maria managed to ask, her voice a ruined whisper. "You could be punished terrible for this." Josiah's eyes, old beyond his years, met hers. "My mama was sold away when I was 5, he said. "Overseer wanted her for himself, and when she fought back, they sold her to get rid of the problem. I know what it's like to lose family to these evil men's. I know what it's like to be helpless. Maybe I can't do much, but I can do this." He came every night after that, risking everything to bring her water, bits of food, news from the quarters. He became her lifeline, her connection to humanity, her reminder that kindness could survive even in hell. And Maria, lying in her trunk as the days crawled past, began to hope again. Not hope for rescue. She knew none was coming, but hope for survival. Hope for the day when she'd be free of this torture. Hope for the reckoning that was coming, that had to be coming, because this kind of evil couldn't stand forever. The ancestors whispered their encouragement in her dreams. The spirits of resistance gathered around her wooden prison like guardian angels. And deep inside, in a place the trunk couldn't reach, Maria's rage continued to burn. A fire that 60 days of suffering would only make fiercer. Listen here now. 'Cause what I'm about to tell you shows how cruelty don't just visit the one being punished. It spreads like poison through a whole community, infecting everyone it touches, forcing good people to do wicked things just to survive. The middle weeks in the trunk, days 15 through 30, they was when Hawthorne refined his torture, when he showed that breaking a body weren't enough for him. He wanted to break spirits, break families, break the very bonds that held us together. In them days of deep sorrow, the plantation operated under a special kind of darkness. The cotton needed picking. It always needed picking. And life went on for everyone except Maria, trapped in her wooden hell. But Hawthorne made sure her punishment remained visible, remained central, remained a daily reminder of what happened to slaves who forgot their place. Day 15 brought a new horror. Adana, who'd been keeping her distance as ordered but watching from afar whenever she could, was caught by Crane standing near the trunk at dawn, praying over her daughter. She wasn't touching Maria, wasn't speaking to her, just standing there with her head bowed and her lips moving in silent prayer. Crane dragged her away by her hair, threw her down in front of the big house where Hawthorne was taking his morning coffee on the porch. "This wench been disobeying orders, massa," Crane announced, breathing hard from exertion and excitement. "Been sneaking around that trunk talking to the girl." "I wasn't talking," Adana cried, her voice breaking. "I was just praying, just asking the Lord to watch over my child. That ain't against the law." Hawthorne set down his coffee cup with deliberate slowness. "Everything you do is against the law if I say it is," he replied. "I gave clear orders. No one helps the girl, no one speaks to her, no one shows her any kindness. You violated that order." "Please, massa, she my baby. She all I got left in this world. You can't expect a mama to—" "I expect you to obey," Hawthorne cut her off. "Crane, take her to the post, 20 lashes, and make sure her daughter can hear everyone." What happened next still makes me weep to remember it all these years later. They stripped Adana to the waist, tied her to the whipping post within sight of Maria's trunk, and Crane laid into her with that terrible whip. Each strike cut deep, splitting skin, drawing blood, making Adana scream in a way that was barely human, and Maria had to lie there, helpless, listening to her mama's agony, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but scream herself, adding her voice to her mama's in a chorus of suffering that made even some of the hardest overseers look away. 20 lashes, everyone a punishment for loving her child. Everyone designed to torture Maria as much as Adana. And when it was over, when they cut Adana down and she collapsed in the dirt, Hawthorne made his final twist of the knife. "You want to pray?" he called to Adana's broken form. "Pray loud enough for your daughter to hear. Pray for her to learn obedience. Pray for her to understand that her rebellion brought this punishment on you. Go on, pray." Adana, her back streaming blood, managed to lift her head, and in a voice that shook with pain and sorrow but wouldn't break, she said, "I pray the Lord watches over my Maria. I pray he gives her strength to endure. I pray he remembers every lash, every tear, every drop of blood spilled here, and I pray he brings justice in his time, even if we don't live to see it." It wasn't the prayer Hawthorne wanted, but he let it stand, perhaps recognizing that broken bones heal easier than broken spirits. And Adana's spirit was still defiantly whole despite everything. From that day forward, Maria's punishment became the whole community's punishment. Hawthorne understood that the quickest way to break her was to hurt everyone she loved, to make her suffering the cause of others' pain, to twist her defiance into guilt. Day 17, they caught Big Moses slipping her water during the night. His punishment was the stocks. 3 days with his head and hands trapped, unable to move, forced to soil himself, while other slaves were ordered to throw rotten vegetables and spit on him as they passed. He endured it without complaint, and when they finally released him, he looked at Maria with eyes that said clearly, "Worth it, you worth it." Day 20, little Sarah was whipped for leaving a small cloth near the trunk, not touching Maria, just leaving it where she might see it. A reminder that she wasn't forgotten. 5 lashes for a child of 11 years old, delivered while her conjure woman grandmother was forced to watch. But the old woman's eyes blazed with something that made even Crane nervous. After Sarah's punishment, she walked close enough to the trunk that Maria could hear her, though she didn't look directly at the girl. "The crossroads remembers," the old woman said as if talking to herself. "The ancestors keep an account. Every tear, every lash, every wrong. It all gets written in blood that won't wash away. Time's coming when the balance tips. Time's coming when the wicked pay dear." It was prophecy disguised as mumbling, promise wrapped in riddles. And Maria, lying in her trunk, held onto those words like a lifeline. The worst came on day 23. Ruth, Maria's closest friend, was caught bringing not food or water, but something more precious. A small piece of paper with words of encouragement written in shaky letters. Ruth had learned some reading from Thomas too, had spent precious time crafting a message. "Stay strong. We love you. Freedom coming someday." Hawthorne read the message aloud to the assembled slaves during the evening gathering, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look at this. Niggers learning to read and write, passing secret messages, planning who knows what. This is what comes of leniency, of allowing you people Sunday gatherings and prayer meetings." He looked at Ruth, who stood trembling but defiant, her chin raised despite her fear. "You wrote this?" "Yes, Massa." "Where'd you learn to write?" Ruth stayed silent. She wouldn't betray Thomas, wouldn't give up the secret of the hollow tree and the discarded books. Even facing punishment, she wouldn't condemn others. Hawthorne nodded slowly, almost respectfully. "Brave, stupid but brave." He turned to Crane. "Sell her." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Sell her. Not whip her, not punish her in some temporary way, but rip her away from everyone and everything she knew. Send her to some unknown plantation where she'd be alone and friendless and trapped. Ruth's mother screamed. Other women began to wail. But Ruth just stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking at Maria one last time with an expression that said, "This ain't your fault. Don't you dare blame yourself. I chose this." They took her away the next morning, chained to 3 other slaves Hawthorne had decided to sell. Maria watched through tears as her best friend disappeared down the road, and something inside her hardened further. The guilt Hawthorne wanted her to feel? She refused it. Instead, she transformed it into rage, into determination, into fuel for the vengeance that was building inside her like pressure in a sealed pot. As the days wore on, the visits to her trunk became a daily torture. Field hands passed by on their way to work, and under Hawthorne's orders, they were forced to say cruel things, to mock her, to spit near her head. Most did it half-heartedly, their eyes apologizing even as their mouths cursed. But a few, the ones who'd sold their souls to survive, relished it, particularly Samuel the driver, who'd chosen to be the masses' dog rather than his fellow slave's brother. "Look at the uppity gal now," Samuel would crow, loud enough for the overseers to hear. "Thought you was so smart trying to poison Massa. How's that working out for you? You comfortable down there in your nice wooden bed?" Maria learned to close her eyes when Samuel came by, to shut out his voice, to retreat into that place inside where his words couldn't reach. But it hurt nonetheless, this betrayal by one of her own. This reminder that bondage didn't just pit black against white, but sometimes set black against black, turning victim against victim in the fight to survive. But there were others, blessed souls who found ways to show support despite the danger. Dinah the cook would walk past and let her apron brush against Maria's head. Brief contact, barely noticeable, but connection nonetheless. The blacksmith would whistle certain spirituals when he passed, songs with coded meanings that told her people were planning, thinking, preparing for something even if they didn't know what yet. And every night young Josiah still came, still risked everything to bring water and scraps of food, to whisper news of the outside world, to remind Maria that kindness hadn't been completely extinguished by Hawthorne's cruelty. "Your mama's healing," he'd whisper on day 25. "Back still hurts something terrible, but she working the fields again. She sings your name sometimes when she thinks nobody listening." Ruth made it to the trader's wagon, he reported on day 28. She looked back this way before they left. "Want you to know she wasn't crying no more, just standing tall, head up like you taught her." These small mercies kept Maria alive in more than just the physical sense. They reminded her that she was fighting for something bigger than herself, that her suffering had meaning, that the bonds between enslaved people couldn't be completely broken even by the most determined cruelty. By day 30, halfway through her sentence, Maria had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Her body was wasted, muscles atrophied, skin covered in sores and insect bites. But her spirit? Lord have mercy, her spirit was forged steel now, tempered by suffering into something unbreakable. She'd stopped flinching when Hawthorne came to taunt her, stopped crying when forced to witness others punished for showing her kindness, stopped hoping for rescue or mercy or any relief except what she could create herself if this torture finally ended. Instead, she planned. In the long hours between day and night, between one agony and the next, she planned. She memorized every detail of Hawthorne's routine, every weakness in Crane's vigilance, every moment when the plantation's guard was down. She built in her mind a map of violence, a blueprint for retribution, a strategy for the reckoning that was coming. Because it was coming. She could feel it in her bones, hear it in the whispers of the ancestors, see it in her dreams when exhaustion finally pulled her into fitful sleep. The trunk wasn't breaking her. It was creating something new, something dangerous. Something that would make the whole system of bondage tremble when it finally emerged from this wooden coffin. On the 30th night, she had a vision. Maybe it was fever. Her body had been fighting infection for days. Maybe it was dehydration making her brain misfire. Or maybe it was real. A true message from the spirits her mama had taught her to honor. She saw an old woman, African features proud and regal, wearing clothing that predated the slave trade. The woman bent close to Maria's face, and when she spoke, her voice was thunder, and ocean waves and the sound of chains breaking. "Endure, daughter. Your suffering ain't meaningless. Every tear is a seed. Every drop of blood waters the ground. Come harvest time, the crop gonna be justice. But you got to survive to see it. You got to hold on just a little longer." Maria tried to speak, to ask questions, but the vision faded like morning mist, leaving only the certainty that she would survive, that her story didn't end in this trunk, that something greater waited beyond these 60 days of hell. 30 days down, 30 more to go. The worst was yet to come, but so was the best. So was the moment when everything would change. So was the day when Maria do Tronco would rise from this wooden grave and show the world what happens when you try to bury someone who was meant to burn. Now you see, people. Sometimes salvation comes from the places you least expect, from souls you'd never think had the courage to risk everything for another. Young Josiah, that 10-year-old house slave who'd been bringing Maria water and scraps in the dead of night, he was about to become something more than just a helper. He was about to become the thread that would weave together the fabric of resistance, the messenger who'd carry hope between the trunk and the quarters. The boy who'd prove that even the smallest among us can shake the foundations of tyranny. In them days of deep sorrow, around day 35 of Maria's imprisonment, Josiah started taking bigger risks. It weren't enough no more to just sneak her water and bread. He could see she was fading, her body wasting away despite his small offerings, her spirit still burning bright but her flesh failing. So he started bringing her news, real news, the kind that could get him killed if he was caught. "Miss Maria," he'd whisper in the darkness, his young voice steady despite his trembling hands. "There's talk in the quarters, big talk. Some of the men, they saying enough is enough. They seeing what Massa doing to you, to Miss Adana, to Miss Ruth who got sold away, and they saying maybe it's time to rise up." Maria's eyes, sunken deep in her skull after 5 weeks in the trunk, flickered with interest. "Who's talking?" she managed to croak, her voice barely human after so long. "Big Moses, he the main one. Got him some followers too. Field hands, strong-backed men who ain't scared of dying if it means fighting back. They been meeting in the Hush Harbor, that secret place deep in the woods where we hold real church, not that fake worship Massa allows on Sundays." The Hush Harbor. Maria knew of it, though she'd never been. It was where slaves gathered in the dead of night to practice their true religion, mixing African traditions with Christianity, calling on gods both old and new, plotting freedom in whispers that the white folks couldn't hear. "What they planning?" Maria asked, her heart beating faster despite her weakness. Josiah glanced around nervously, though they was alone in the darkness, though the nearest white person was sleeping safe in the big house. They talking about burning the cotton fields, maybe burning the big house too. They talking about killing Massa Hawthorne and Overseer Crane, taking what weapons they can find and running for the swamps, trying to make it to the Maroons, them free black folks living in the bayous where the paddy rollers can't reach. It was madness. Beautiful, desperate madness. The kind of rebellion that got people hanged or burned alive or torn apart by dogs. But it was also hope. The first real hope Maria had felt since being trapped in this wooden hell. "When?" she whispered urgently. "Don't know yet. They waiting for a sign, they say. Waiting for the right moment. But Miss Maria..." Josiah's voice dropped even lower. "They waiting for you. Big Moses, he say you the spark that started this fire. He say if you can survive that trunk, if you can endure what Massa putting you through without breaking, then maybe they can find the courage to fight back too." Tears stung Maria's eyes, the first she'd shed in weeks. She'd thought her suffering was pointless, thought Hawthorne had won by making her the cause of others' pain. But Josiah was telling her different. Her resistance, her refusal to break, her silent defiance visible to everyone who passed. It wasn't weakness. It was inspiration. It was planting seeds of rebellion in soil that had been barren for too long. "Tell them," she said, her voice gaining strength despite her physical weakness. "Tell them I ain't broken. Tell them I'm still here, still fighting, still believing that freedom's possible. Tell them when I get out of this trunk, I'm gonna make Massa Hawthorne pay for every lash, every tear, every soul he's destroyed. And tell them I need them to wait just a little longer. Be patient, be smart. 'Cause a rebellion that fails just gets more people killed. But a rebellion that's planned right, timed right, that could actually work." Josiah nodded, his eyes wide with something like awe. Here was this girl, barely older than him, trapped in a wooden coffin for more than a month, and she was still thinking strategy, still planning resistance, still refusing to give up. But their conversation that night was interrupted by footsteps, heavy and stumbling. Someone was coming, and from the uneven gait and muttered cursing it was clear they was drunk. "Hide," Maria hissed, and Josiah melted into the shadows like smoke, pressing himself against the wall of the nearest cabin, holding his breath. Thaddeus Crane stumbled into view, a bottle of moonshine in one hand, swaying on his feet. He'd been drinking heavy lately. Maria had noticed it even from her limited vantage point. Word in the quarters passed along by Josiah was that Crane's wife had left him, gone back to her family in South Carolina, unable to stomach his cruelty and his drinking no more. Crane stood over Maria's trunk, looking down at her with bleary eyes. "You still alive down there, gal? Still breathing?" Maria didn't answer, didn't move. Sometimes playing dead was the smartest strategy. "You know what your problem is?" Crane slurred, taking a swig from his bottle. "You too proud. Too full of yourself. Thinking you better than what you are, thinking you got rights like white folks. But you ain't nothing. You just property. Just a thing we own, same as a mule or a plow." He spat tobacco juice that landed near Maria's head, the brown liquid splashing her cheek. She didn't flinch, didn't react, just stared up at the night sky visible above her wooden prison. "My wife left me," Crane continued, his voice turning maudlin the way drunks' voices do. "Said I was too hard, too mean. Said she couldn't stand to watch what we do here no more. But what does she know? She just a weak woman, don't understand how things got to be. You keep slaves in line through fear. That's the natural order. That's how God intended it." From his hiding place, Josiah watched and listened, his young mind recording every word, every detail. This was information that might prove useful later, this glimpse of weakness in the overseer's armor. Crane took another drink, then did something unexpected. He sat down in the dirt near Maria's trunk, his back against a fence post, and just talked. Like she was a person instead of property. Like her forced silence made her a safe confessor for his drunken thoughts. "Sometimes I wonder if we ain't all damned," he said quietly. "All of us, masters and slaves both. Damned for what we do in here, for this whole system of bondage. My daddy was an overseer too, you know. Died young, liver gave out from drinking. My granddaddy before him, same thing. Like there's a curse on men who make their living off other folks' suffering." Maria listened, fascinated despite herself. This was the man who'd killed her baby brother, who'd beaten her mama bloody, who'd gleefully participated in her own torture. And here he was, admitting doubt, confessing fear, revealing the rot at the core of the system that gave him power. "But what choice we got?" Crane continued. "I ain't educated, ain't got no skills besides knowing how to make niggers work. This all I know, this all I am. And if I show weakness, if I show mercy, then the whole thing falls apart. Can't have slaves thinking we soft. Can't have them thinking they equal to us." He fell silent then, drinking steadily, and eventually his head dropped forward in drunken sleep. He snored there against the fence post, vulnerable and pathetic, while Maria lay trapped and Josiah watched from the shadows. After a long while, when Crane's snores had settled into a steady rhythm, Josiah crept out from hiding. He looked at the sleeping overseer, then at Maria, a question in his eyes. He could kill Crane right now, could brain him with a rock, strangle him with his bare hands while he slept defenseless. One less tormentor in the world. But Maria, reading his thoughts, shook her head slightly. "No," she mouthed. "Not yet, not like this." Because killing a passed-out drunk wasn't justice. It was just murder, and it would bring terrible retribution down on the entire slave community. When the reckoning came, it needed to be public, needed to be unmistakable, needed to mean something beyond just revenge. Josiah understood. He nodded, gave Maria one last look of solidarity, and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving Crane to sleep off his whiskey and his guilt. But before he left, the boy did something that would prove crucial later. He noticed that in his drunken stupor, Crane had dropped his keys. The ring of iron keys that opened every lock on the plantation, including the padlocks on Maria's trunk. Josiah picked them up quiet as a ghost, pressed them into the dirt near Maria's head where she could see them, but Crane wouldn't notice when he woke. "Just so you know they there," Josiah whispered, so soft Maria almost didn't hear. "When the time comes, you'll know what to do." Then he was gone, leaving Maria staring at those keys gleaming in the moonlight, so close and yet impossibly far, hope and frustration warring in her chest. The next morning, Crane woke with a terrible headache and no memory of his late-night confession. He found his keys in the dirt, cursed his carelessness, and stumbled back to his quarters without even looking at Maria. But the damage was done. Maria had seen his weakness, heard his doubts, understood that the men who enslaved her people were themselves trapped by the system they perpetuated. It didn't make her hate them less. If anything, it made her hate them more for choosing to uphold evil rather than fight against it. And she had a new weapon now. Knowledge. Knowledge of Crane's guilt, of the planning happening in the Hush Harbor, of the keys that existed and could be stolen. Knowledge of Josiah's courage, of Big Moses's leadership, of the rebellion brewing just below the surface of the plantation's daily routine. Day 36 dawned hot and heavy, promising rain that wouldn't come. Maria lay in her trunk, weaker in body but stronger in spirit, counting down the days until her sentence ended. 24 more days. Less than a month. She could survive that. She would survive that. And when she emerged from this wooden grave, when they finally pulled her out and she stood on solid ground again, she would show them all what a broken slave looked like when she chose to stay broken no more. The ancestors whispered their approval. The spirits gathered closer, lending their strength. And in the quarters, in the Hush Harbor, in the secret spaces where hope survived despite everything designed to kill it, the people waited for their sign, their spark, their Maria de Tronco to rise again. Listen here now. 'Cause days 40 through 45 was when Maria's body truly began to fail, when the flesh started giving out, even though the spirit burned brighter than ever. But they was also when the ancestors drew closest, when the veil between this world and the next grew thin as spider silk, when Maria walked paths that living folks ain't supposed to walk and came back with knowledge that would change everything. In them days of deep sorrow, her physical decline was terrible to witness. Her skin, once smooth and brown as polished wood, had turned ashen and papery, stretched tight over bones that showed through like tent poles. Her hair, which Adana had always kept neat despite their bondage, now hung in matted clumps, home to lice and other vermin that feasted on her helpless flesh. Her eyes had sunk so deep in her skull that they looked like they was peering out from a grave, and when she blinked, the movement seemed to take tremendous effort. The sores covering her body had become infected, weeping pus and blood, attracting flies that laid eggs in the wounds. Maggots worked their way into her flesh, and though the thought should have filled her with horror, Maria had learned from old Bessie's teachings that sometimes maggots was a blessing. They ate dead tissue, kept infection from spreading deeper. Her body was dying in pieces bit by bit, but something kept the core of her alive, kept her heart beating, kept her lungs drawing breath. Old Bessie herself came by on day 41, bold as brass despite Hawthorne's orders. She walked right up to the trunk in broad daylight, and when Crane started to chase her away, she fixed him with a look that made him stop cold. "I ain't here to help her," Bessie said, her ancient voice carrying across the yard. "I'm here to see if she dead yet. Massa wants to know if his punishment working, don't he? Well, I'm checking." It was a lie, transparent as glass, but Crane was superstitious enough about conjure women that he didn't push it. He stood back, watching warily as Bessie knelt beside Maria's head. "Child," Bessie whispered, her gnarled hands hovering over Maria's fevered brow without quite touching. "You walking between worlds now. I can see it in your eyes. You got one foot here and one foot in the spirit realm. That's dangerous territory." "I know," Maria croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been seeing things, Bessie. Dead folks walking around like they still alive. My baby brother Joseph, he come to me last night, told me I got work to finish here before I can cross over." Bessie nodded slowly. "That's the ancestors talking. They keeping you tethered to this world 'cause your story ain't done yet. But Maria, listen to me careful now. When you that close to death, when you walking them spirit roads, you can bring things back with you. Power, knowledge, but it comes with a price. What kind of price? The kind you pay in blood and pain and pieces of your soul. The kind that marks you forever, sets you apart from regular folks. You already got the sight, child. You already touched by the crossroads. But if you go deeper, if you really walk them roads and come back, you won't never be the same. You understand what I'm saying?" Maria's fever-bright eyes met Bessie's ancient ones. "I understand, and I don't care. Whatever it takes to survive this, to get strong enough to make them pay, I'll pay that price." Bessie's wrinkled face softened with something like sorrow. Then listen. Tonight, when the moon rises full, you let yourself slip deeper into that spirit realm. Don't fight the fever. Don't fight the pain. Let it carry you down. The ancestors will meet you there, and they'll teach you what you need to know. But Maria, you got to promise me something. What? Don't let the hate consume you. Vengeance is just... Revenge is righteous when it's earned like you earned it. But if you let it turn your heart all the way black, you become like them. You become the monster they say we are. You keep some piece of your humanity. You hear me? You hold on to love alongside the hate, or you lose everything that makes you worth saving. Before Maria could respond, Crane's voice cut through the moment. All right, old woman. You had your look. She ain't dead. Now get on before I give you a taste of the whip. Bessie stood, her joints creaking, and shuffled away. But she'd left something behind. Maria could feel it. A warmth spreading through her chest despite the fever. A sense of protection, of being wrapped in invisible arms. Bessie had worked some kind of root work, some conjure that would help her survive the spirit journey to come. That night, as promised, the full moon rose like a silver coin in the black velvet sky. Maria lay in her trunk, her body racked with fever, her mind starting to drift. She didn't fight it this time. She let herself sink, let the fever carry her down into darkness deeper than any she'd known. And then she was walking, not in her broken body, but in spirit form, walking roads that existed between life and death, between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. The landscape around her was Georgia, but not Georgia. The same red clay, the same trees, but everything shimmered with otherworldly light, and the air thrummed with power that made her spirit skin tingle. She wasn't alone. Figures materialized around her, some she recognized and some she didn't. There was Joseph, her baby brother, no longer broken but whole and beautiful, smiling at her with love that brought tears she couldn't physically cry. There was her father Kofi, though he wasn't dead yet in the living world. But here in the spirit realm, time moved different, and she understood somehow that this was his soul visiting from Louisiana, reaching across the miles to see his daughter one more time. "Daddy," she breathed, and he wrapped her in arms that felt real despite being made of spirit and starlight. "My fierce girl," he said, his voice the same as she remembered. "Look at you. They tried to break you, tried to bury you alive, but you still standing. I'm so proud of you, Maria. So proud. Are you alive still, in Louisiana?" His smile was sad. "For now. The sugarcane work, it's killing me slow. But don't grieve for me yet, child. I lived long enough to know you survived, to know you're gonna do something important. That's enough." Other figures pressed closer. An old woman who looked like Adana but older, grander, wearing the regalia of African royalty. "I am your grandmother's grandmother," she announced in a voice like drums and ocean waves. "I was a queen before the slavers came, before they stole us from our land. You carry my blood, child. You carry the strength of warriors and the wisdom of griots. Use it well." More ancestors appeared, stretching back through generations, a line of resistance and survival that predated slavery, that predated colonization, that reached all the way back to the beginning when black folks walked free under African skies. They showed her things, how to endure pain beyond endurance, how to find strength when strength should be gone, how to turn suffering into power. But they also showed her the future, or possible futures, visions that flickered like candlelight in the dark. She saw herself rising from the trunk, saw the moment of her vengeance, saw Hawthorne's blood staining the very wood that had imprisoned her. But she also saw alternatives, timelines where she died in the trunk, where the rebellion failed, where her suffering meant nothing. "The future ain't fixed," the Queen Ancestor told her. "You got choices still to make. The path you walking, it's dangerous. You might win freedom or you might win death. Either one's better than bondage, but you got to choose which you fighting for." "I choose both," Maria said, her spirit voice strong and sure. "I choose freedom if I can get it, death if I can't. But either way, I choose to fight." The ancestors hummed their approval, a sound like bees and thunder and the beating of a million hearts. Then they began to teach her. They showed her which prayers called which spirits, which herbs could poison and which could heal, which stars to follow if she ever ran, which rivers to cross, which paths led to the maroons in the swamps. They taught her about the Middle Passage, about the millions who died in the crossing, whose bones littered the ocean floor like a road of death leading from Africa to America. They taught her that her suffering, terrible as it was, connected her to something larger, a history of resistance, a legacy of survival, a promise that one day, somehow, the chains would break. And they taught her about power, real power, the kind that came from standing at the crossroads between worlds, from carrying death in one hand and life in the other, from being someone who'd been buried but refused to stay dead. When you rise from that trunk, the Queen Ancestor said, you won't be the girl who went in. You'll be something new, something fierce. Use that power for your people, child. Use it to strike back at evil. But remember what the old woman told you. Keep some piece of your heart soft, or you lose what makes you human. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision started to fade. The ancestors began to disappear, their forms dissolving like morning mist. Kofi hugged her one last time, whispering, "Live, Maria. Live and fight and win." Joseph blew her a kiss, his child's laughter echoing. The Queen Ancestor placed a hand on her head in blessing, and Maria felt something settle into her spirit. A gift, a weapon, a mark of power that she'd carry back to the living world. She woke gasping, her body still trapped in the trunk, but her spirit renewed, transformed. The fever had broken. The worst of her infections seemed less angry, as if the spirit journey had somehow helped her physical form. She was still desperately weak, still suffering, still imprisoned. But she was alive. And more than that, she was ready. Day 45 dawned clear and bright. Maria had 15 days left in the trunk. Just 15 more days and then the reckoning would begin. That morning, when Hawthorne came to check on her as he did daily, he stopped short. Something in Maria's eyes had changed. They no longer held the desperation of a suffering victim. Instead, they blazed with purpose, with certainty, with a power that made him take an unconscious step backward. "You're still alive," he said, and for the first time, there was uncertainty in his voice. "I am," Maria replied, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "and I'm gonna stay alive. Every day you keep me in this trunk, I get stronger, Massa. Every moment of this suffering, I'm learning. You think you breaking me, but you just forging me into something you gonna regret creating." Hawthorne's face flushed with anger, but underneath it, Maria could see fear. Good. Let him be afraid. He should be afraid. 15 more days, he said, trying to reassert control. "Then I'm selling you away from here, getting rid of you before you cause more trouble." 15 more days, Maria agreed, her smile cold and knowing. "We'll see what happens then, Massa. We'll see what happens then." As he walked away, she heard him mutter to Crane, "Watch her close, something's changed, something ain't right." But it was too late for caution. The wheel was already in motion. The ancestors had spoken. The spirits had blessed her journey. And Maria du Tronco, the girl in the trunk, was counting down to freedom or death with equal anticipation. Either way, the masters of Willow Bend Plantation would soon learn that you can't bury fire. You can only make it burn hotter. Now listen here, people. 'Cause what happened in them last 2 weeks of Maria's imprisonment was something that defied natural law. Something that made even the most skeptical among us believe in powers beyond what the eye can see. Days 46 through 55 was when the spirit realm and the living world started bleeding together. When Maria became something more than human. When her very presence began to change the atmosphere of Willow Bend Plantation in ways that couldn't be denied. In them days of deep sorrow, the visions didn't stop after that first spirit journey. If anything, they intensified, came more frequent, stayed longer. Maria would be lying in her trunk under the burning Georgia sun, and suddenly she'd see Anansi, the spider trickster, sitting on the edge of the wood, his 8 legs folded, his many eyes gleaming with ancient mischief. "Little sister," Anansi would say in a voice like rustling leaves. You want to know the secret of survival? It ain't strength. It ain't even courage. It's cunning. It's knowing when to fight and when to appear weak. It's making your enemies think they've won right up until the moment you spring the trap. He'd spin webs in the air, intricate patterns that looked like maps, like battle plans, like the interconnected relationships between everyone on the plantation. See how everything connects? The master depends on the overseer depends on the driver depends on keeping other slaves fearful. But fear's a web too, and webs can be cut. You just got to find the right thread. Then he'd disappear like smoke, leaving Maria with insights that felt more real than fever dreams, strategies that formed in her mind with crystalline clarity. Other spirits came too. Sometimes it was her grandmother, the one who died before Maria was born, teaching her the old songs, the ones that carried power in their rhythms. Sometimes it was warriors from the old country, showing her how to turn everyday objects into weapons, how to fight when you got nothing but your body and your will. And sometimes it was the spirits of slaves who died on Willow Bend itself, angry ghosts who prowled the plantation grounds seeking justice they'd never received in life. We're waiting, they'd whisper, waiting for someone strong enough to be our voice, our hands, our vengeance. Are you that one, Maria do Tronco? Are you the one who'll make them pay for all of us? And Maria, lying in her wooden prison, would whisper back, I am. I will. I swear it on my blood and my suffering. The plantation slaves noticed the change in her. When they walked past her trunk now, they felt something they couldn't name. A presence, a power, an energy that made the hair on their arms stand up. Some were frightened by it, crossed themselves or made warding signs, but others were drawn to it, felt their own spirits lifting, their own courage growing. Little Sarah's grandmother, that old conjure woman, came by on day 48 despite the danger. She didn't speak to Maria directly, just walked past slow, her ancient voice carrying what sounded like a casual comment to herself but was really a message. The spirits gathering thick these days, she said to the air. Can feel them all around, pressing close, waiting for something. Old ones say when the spirits gather like this, it means a change coming, a big change, the kind that shakes the earth and breaks what needs breaking. At night, the singing from the quarters grew louder, more defiant. The spirituals they sang wasn't just about Jesus and heaven no more. They was about Moses leading people out of bondage, about walls falling down in Jericho, about giants being slain by shepherd boys with nothing but stones and faith. The coded messages wasn't even subtle anymore. They was practically shouting their plans to the sky, daring the white folks to understand. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. The voices would rise and fall like waves, and Maria, trapped in her trunk, would add her own voice when she could, a thin thread of sound that somehow carried despite her weakness. And the other slaves would hear it and sing louder, inspired by this girl who wouldn't break, couldn't break, who'd somehow turned suffering into strength. Hawthorne heard the singing and it worried him. He called Crane to the big house on day 50, his face troubled. The niggers are getting restless, he said, pacing his study. Ever since we put that girl in the trunk, something's been off. They're not as obedient, not as fearful. It's like she's become some kind of symbol to them. Crane spat into a spittoon. Want me to take her out early? Sell her now before she causes more trouble? No, Hawthorne said slowly, his pride warring with his caution. I said 60 days, and it'll be 60 days. I won't be seen as backing down from a slave. But watch them close. If there's any sign of rebellion, any hint of uprising, you put it down hard. Make examples, break heads if you have to. But Crane himself was uneasy around Maria now. When he came by to deliver her daily rations, the thin gruel that barely kept her alive, he wouldn't meet her eyes anymore. Because when he did, he saw things there that made his skin crawl. He saw his own death reflected in those dark pools. He saw judgment coming for him like a slow-moving storm. On day 52, something happened that would become legend among the plantation slaves for generations to come. A field hand named Abraham, one of the men Big Moses had recruited for the planned rebellion, was being whipped for talking back to Samuel the driver. It was brutal even by the standards of Willow Bend. 30 lashes, each one drawing blood, each one making Abraham cry out in agony. Maria could hear the whipping from her trunk, could hear Abraham's screams, and something inside her snapped. The rage that had been building for 52 days, the power she'd gathered from her spirit journeys, the strength lent to her by the ancestors. It all came together in one moment of pure will. She began to sing. Not a spiritual, not a work song, but something older. Something in a language she'd never learned but somehow knew. It was Kimbundu, her mama's tongue, words of power and curse that had been passed down from African soil. The singing started quiet, but it grew. Her voice, which should have been weak and broken, rang out clear and strong, carrying across the plantation yard. And as she sang, the strangest thing happened. Abraham stopped screaming. His body went rigid on the whipping post, but his face lost its expression of agony, went blank and peaceful, like he'd been transported somewhere else. Crane kept whipping, but Abraham didn't react, didn't cry out, seemed to feel nothing at all. Crane stopped, confused and frightened. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking around wildly. "What's happening?" The gathered slaves knew. They could feel it. Maria had somehow called on the ancestors, had used root work or conjure or pure spiritual power to shield Abraham from pain. It shouldn't have been possible. She was trapped in a trunk, weak and dying. But she'd done it anyway, had reached across the space between them and given him a gift of numbness, of protection. When Crane finally cut Abraham down, the field hand stood on shaking legs and turned toward Maria's trunk. He couldn't see her face from where he stood, but he raised his hands to the sky in a gesture of thanks, of recognition, of reverence. "She touched by God," someone whispered in the crowd. "Or something older than God. Something the white folks don't understand and can't control." The news spread through the quarters like wildfire that night. Maria had worked a miracle. Maria had power. Maria was more than just a girl in a trunk. She was becoming a prophet, a conjure woman, a vessel for forces that predated Christianity and slavery both. Big Moses came to Josiah with a message. "Tell her we're ready. Tell her when she gets out we'll be waiting for her word. Whatever she needs, however she wants to do this, we're with her. She's proven herself. She's earned our loyalty with her blood and her suffering." Josiah, risking everything as he did every night, crept to Maria's trunk in the darkness and whispered the message. Maria, her eyes fever-bright but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks, smiled. "Tell Moses to gather the men," she whispered back. "Tell them on the night of the 60th day, when they finally pull me out of this trunk, that's when we move. That's when everything changes. But they got to be patient just a little longer. They got to trust me." "They do trust you," Josiah said. "Miss Maria, they'd follow you into hell itself if you asked them to." "Good," Maria said, her voice hard as iron despite her physical weakness. "Because that's exactly where we're going. Straight into hell to drag out the devils and make them pay." Days 53, 54, 55 passed in a blur of visions and planning. The ancestors came and went, teaching Maria things she'd need to know. Anansi showed her how to spot weakness in her enemies, how to exploit fear, how to turn the master's own cruelty against them. The warrior spirits taught her about timing, about patience, about striking when the enemy least expected it. And through it all, Maria's body continued to fail even as her spirit grew stronger. It was like she was burning herself up from the inside out, using her own life force as fuel for the transformation she was undergoing. She knew, on some level, that she might not survive much longer even if they pulled her from the trunk. The infections, the starvation, the physical trauma, it had all taken a toll that might be too great to recover from. But she didn't care. She'd made her peace with death weeks ago. All that mattered now was lasting 5 more days, reaching that 60th day, emerging from this wooden coffin one final time to deliver the justice she'd promised. On day 55, exactly 5 days before her sentence would end, Hawthorne came to her trunk with unexpected news. "I've decided to let you out early," he announced, his face carefully neutral. "You've proven your point. I've proven mine. Keeping you here longer serves no purpose." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He was afraid of what Maria had become, afraid of the restlessness in the quarters, afraid that his cruelty had created something he couldn't control. He wanted her out and sold away before she could inspire actual rebellion. But Maria, with the wisdom the ancestors had given her, knew exactly what to say. "No, Massa. I stay the full 60 days. You gave me a sentence, and I'll serve every moment of it. I ain't gonna give you the satisfaction of thinking you broke me enough to beg for early release. 5 more days. I can wait 5 more days." Hawthorne's face flushed with anger and something else. Respect, perhaps, or fear disguised as respect. He nodded curtly and walked away, his back stiff with barely controlled rage. 5 more days. Just 5 more days until the reckoning began. Now you see, people, them last 5 days in the trunk was when Maria walked closest to death, when her body was failing so completely that only her iron will and the ancestors' intervention kept her breathing. Days 56 through 59 was a kind of purgatory, a suspended state between living and dying, where time moved strange and the boundary between worlds grew thin as paper. In them days of deep sorrow, Maria's physical form had wasted to almost nothing. Her arms inside the trunk was like sticks wrapped in paper-thin skin. Her ribs showed through her chest like prison bars. Her legs had atrophied so badly she didn't know if they'd even hold her weight when she finally stood. The infections that had seemed to heal after her spirit journey had returned with a vengeance, making her skin hot to the touch, filling her mind with fever dreams that mixed with the ancestral visions until she couldn't tell what was real and what was spirit walking. But her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes still burned bright. Brighter than ever, actually, like all the life force draining from her body had concentrated itself in those dark pools. When people passed and dared to look at her face, they'd shudder and turn away. It was like looking into the eyes of death itself, or maybe something beyond death, something that had died and refused to stay buried. Adana came every day now, openly defying Hawthorne's orders. She'd already been whipped once for showing Maria kindness, and she'd decided she didn't care if they whipped her again. Her daughter was dying, and she'd be damned if she'd let her die alone. "Hold on, baby girl," she'd whisper, kneeling in the dirt beside the trunk, her own back still scarred from the lashes she'd received. "Just a few more days. Just a little longer. I know it hurts. I know you're tired. But you're so close now. Don't give up when you're so close." Maria would try to smile, try to reassure her mama, but her lips was too cracked and swollen to manage it properly. Instead, she'd just blink slowly, a signal that she heard, that she understood, that she was still fighting. On day 56, the fever spiked so high that Maria started hallucinating even in the daylight. She saw her daddy Kofi standing beside the trunk, except he was translucent like morning mist, and she knew somehow that he'd finally died in Louisiana, that his spirit had come to say goodbye before moving on. "I'm free now, daughter," his ghost told her. "The cane fields can't hurt me no more, but I ain't crossing over completely till I know you're safe, till I know you survived this." "I will, Daddy," Maria croaked. 3 more days. Just 3 more days and then I'm coming out of this box, and when I do, I'm gonna burn this whole plantation to the ground." Kofi's spirit smiled, proud and sad at once. "That's my girl. That's my fierce, beautiful girl." Then he faded away, and Maria was left with the knowledge that she'd never see him again in this life or any other, that he'd moved on to whatever lay beyond, that she was truly an orphan now, except for her mama. The grief should have broken her, but instead it hardened her further. One more name to add to the list of reasons for vengeance. One more soul crying out for justice. One more debt that Hawthorne and Crane and the whole system of bondage would have to pay. Day 57 brought rain again, but this time Maria was too weak to drink it properly. The water fell on her face, ran into her mouth and nose, and she choked on it, coughing so violently that blood came up with the phlegm. Her lungs was failing, infection settling deep in her chest, making every breath a labor. Josiah found her like that when he came that night, barely breathing, her lips tinged blue, her eyes rolling back in her head. He panicked, thinking she was dying right then, that she wouldn't make it to the 60th day. Miss Maria, stay with me." He poured water on her face, trying to revive her. "You can't die now, not when you're so close. The men are ready, the plan is set. We're all counting on you." Slowly, painfully, Maria's eyes focused on him. She tried to speak but couldn't, her voice completely gone. So instead, she did something she'd learned from the ancestors. She reached out with her spirit, touched Josiah's mind directly, and he heard her voice inside his head, clear as if she'd spoken aloud. "I'm not dying yet. The ancestors won't let me. Not until I finish what I started." Josiah jerked back, frightened by the experience of hearing her voice in his mind. But he also believed her. Because if Maria could do that, if she had that kind of power, then maybe she really could survive long enough to see her vengeance through. "2 more days," he whispered. "Just hold on for 2 more days." Day 58, Hawthorne came to the trunk with his wife Constance. The young woman had been kept away from the brutal reality of the punishment until now, sheltered in the big house. But her husband had decided it was time she understood the full extent of his authority. "This is what happens to slaves who forget their place," he told her, gesturing at Maria's wasted form in the trunk. "This is the price of rebellion, of attempting to poison your masters. Mercy is weakness, Constance. You have to be hard with them, or they'll rise up and slaughter us all in our beds." Constance looked down at Maria, and her face went pale with horror. "Elias," she whispered, This is too cruel. She's just a child. She's dying." "She tried to kill me," Hawthorne said coldly. "Would you rather I'd hanged her? This is merciful by comparison, and it serves as an example to the others." But Constance was staring into Maria's eyes, and what she saw there made her take a step back. "She's not afraid," the young wife said softly. "After all this, after nearly 2 months in that trunk, she's not afraid. She's looking at you like she's already won." Hawthorne glanced down, met Maria's burning gaze, and despite himself, he felt a chill run down his spine. His wife was right. There was no fear in those eyes, no submission, no brokenness, just certainty. Just the absolute conviction of someone who knows exactly what's coming and is prepared for it. "She's delirious from fever," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Doesn't know what she's thinking or seeing." Maria smiled then, a terrible smile that showed teeth in a skull-like face. And though her voice was gone, Hawthorne could have sworn he heard her whisper, "2 more days, Massa. 2 more days till you find out what I'm really made of." He left quickly after that, pulling his disturbed wife with him. Behind them, they could hear singing starting up in the quarters again. That same defiant spiritual about Moses and Pharaoh, about deliverance and freedom, about walls coming down and waters parting. That night, Big Moses himself came to the trunk, risking everything to speak directly to Maria. Josiah had told him about her condition, about how close to death she was, and he needed to know if she'd still be strong enough to lead when the moment came. "Maria," he said quietly, his big hands gentle on the edge of the trunk, "you don't got to do this. We can move without you. We can still rise up, still fight. You don't got to sacrifice yourself for this." Maria's eyes opened, focused on him with effort. Her lips moved, forming words, no sound came out, but Moses understood anyway. "I started this. I finish it. Even if it kills you? Especially if it kills you." Moses nodded slowly, respect and sorrow warring on his face. "Then we'll be ready. Tomorrow night, the 60th night when they pull you out of that trunk, that's when we move. The men know their roles. We've hidden tools and weapons where we can. The moment you give the signal, we rise." Maria managed the smallest nod. It was all the communication they needed. The pact was sealed. Day 59 dawned gray and heavy, thick clouds promising a storm that would break the drought and the tension both. This was the last full day. Tomorrow, in the evening, Hawthorne would have Maria pulled from the trunk. Tomorrow, the 60 days would be complete. Tomorrow, everything would change. Maria spent that final day in a kind of trance, conserving what little strength she had left, preparing mentally and spiritually for what was to come. The ancestors gathered close, so many of them now that she could feel them pressing in from all sides, lending their power, their rage, their hunger for justice. Anansi came one last time, spinning his webs in the air above her head. "Remember, little sister," the trickster said, "the strongest trap is the one the prey doesn't see until it's already caught. Let them think you're helpless. Let them think you're broken, and then show them the truth." The warrior spirits came, their ghostly hands guiding hers through the movements she'd need to make, teaching her muscles that had atrophied for 2 months to remember how to fight, how to kill, how to strike with maximum efficiency despite her weakness. And the queen ancestor, her grandmother's grandmother, came last of all. "Tomorrow you become what you were always meant to be," the royal spirit said. "Not just a slave girl seeking revenge, but a symbol, a warning. Promise to every enslaved person that resistance is possible, that the oppressor can be struck down, that even in chains we are dangerous." "I'm ready," Maria whispered to the spirits, to the ancestors, to herself. "I'm ready." That night, the last night of her imprisonment, the storm finally broke. Thunder shook the ground like African drums calling the gods to witness. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the plantation in stark flashes of white light. Rain poured down in torrents, washing over Maria's broken body, baptizing her in water that felt sacred, that felt like blessing and cleansing both. She lay there in the storm, her mouth open to catch the rain, her eyes fixed on the lightning-torn sky, and she felt something shift inside her. The fever broke suddenly, dramatically, leaving her mind clearer than it had been in days. Her body was still ruined, still weak, still dying inch by inch, but her spirit had never been stronger. Tomorrow she'd rise from this wooden grave. Tomorrow she'd stand on ground that had imprisoned her for 60 days and 60 nights. Tomorrow she'd show Elias Hawthorne and Thaddeus Crane and every white person on Willow Bend Plantation what they'd created with their cruelty. Tomorrow Maria do Tronco would have her reckoning. The storm raged on through the night, and Maria lay in its fury, gathering the thunder into her bones, the lightning into her blood, the rain into her spirit. By dawn, when the storm passed and the sun rose red as blood over Georgia, she was ready. Day 60 had arrived, and with it, justice would finally come home to roost. Listen here now, 'cause day 60 dawned different from all the days before it. The air itself felt charged, electric, like the moments before lightning strikes. Every slave on Willow Bend Plantation could feel it. Something was coming. Something was shifting. The world was about to tilt on its axis, and nothing would ever be the same again. In them days of deep sorrow, Maria lay in her trunk for the last time. Her body ruined, but her spirit blazing like a forge fire. She'd survived what should have killed her 10 times over. 60 days and 60 nights in a wooden coffin, exposed to sun and rain and cold and heat, starved and beaten and infected and fevered. But she was still breathing, still conscious, still ready. The morning started ordinary enough. Field hands trudged to the cotton fields under the driver's watchful eye. House slaves went about their duties in the big house. But there was a tension underneath it all. A collective holding of breath, a sense that everyone was waiting for something, even if they didn't know exactly what. Hawthorne had decreed that Maria would be removed from the trunk at sunset, when all the slaves could be gathered to witness her final humiliation. He planned to have her dragged out, displayed in her weakness and degradation, then sold to the first trader who'd take her away from Willow Bend forever. He wanted one last lesson driven home to his property. This is what rebellion brings you. This is the price of resistance. But as the day wore on, strange things started happening. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence. A horse in the stable went wild, kicking down its stall door and trampling through the yard. The well water turned brackish and foul, undrinkable, forcing everyone to fetch from the river instead. Clouds of crows descended on the cotton fields, hundreds of them cawing and circling like they was gathering for a funeral. Old Bessie, seeing the signs, smiled her gap-toothed smile and whispered to those close enough to hear, "The spirit's restless today. The ancestors walking bold in daylight. Something big coming, oh yes, something the white folks ain't gonna like one bit." In the big house, Constance Hawthorne was seized by a sudden illness, doubled over with cramps and nausea that the doctor couldn't explain. She took to her bed, pale and shaking, insisting she could feel something wrong in the very air, something evil approaching. "It's that girl," she told her husband, her voice weak but certain. "Ever since you put her in that trunk, there's been a darkness over this place. Please, Elias, just let her go. Sell her now before sunset. Get her away from here." But Hawthorne's pride wouldn't allow it. "Nonsense," he snapped. "You're just feeling the heat. The girl's broken, nearly dead. There's nothing to fear from a half-corpse in a trunk." Meanwhile, Maria lay waiting. The chains around the trunk had loosened over the weeks, wood swelling and shrinking with weather changes, metal corroding from her sweat and the rain. She'd been testing them at night when Josiah brought her water, pushing gently, feeling for weakness. And this morning, during the storm's aftermath, she'd discovered something crucial. The lock on the main chain was old, damaged by rust and stress. And if she pushed just right, if she twisted her body in a way that sent screaming agony through her atrophied muscles, she could feel it giving. Not much, not enough to break free entirely, but enough to create slack, enough to move her arms inside the trunk when before they'd been immobile. She worked at it all morning, ignoring the pain, focusing on the goal. Push, twist, test, push, twist, test. Each movement was torture, but she'd learned over 60 days how to exist beyond pain, how to separate her consciousness from her body's suffering. By noon, she'd created enough slack that she could move her right arm almost freely inside the trunk. It was still trapped, still pinned by the wood and iron, but now she had range of motion. Now she could reach things. And buried in the dirt beside her head, right where Josiah had shown her weeks ago, were the keys. Crane's keys that he'd dropped while drunk, that had been pressed into the earth and hidden. Maria's fingers, thin as bird bones, scrabbled in the dirt. Once, twice, 3 times she tried and couldn't reach. But on the 4th attempt, her fingertips brushed cold metal. She stretched further, ignoring the way her shoulder joint screamed, ignoring the feeling of something tearing inside her chest. Just a little more. Got it. The keys were in her hand, slippery with mud and sweat, but solid and real. She had them. She had the means to free herself when the moment came. But not yet. Not until Hawthorne and his men opened the trunk. Not until they thought she was too weak to move. Not until the perfect moment when they least expected resistance. "Patience," Anansi whispered in her mind. "Let the spider show you how to wait in the web." The afternoon dragged on, hot and oppressive despite the previous night's storm. The sun climbed high and began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red like a warning, like blood spreading across cloth. In the quarters, Big Moses gathered his chosen men. There were 12 of them, strong field hands who'd been secretly preparing for this moment. They'd hidden tools that could serve as weapons, hammers from the blacksmith shop, hoe handles that could be clubs, even a few knives stolen from the big house kitchen over weeks of careful planning. "Tonight," Moses told them, his voice low and intense, "when they pull Maria out, when Massa and the overseer are focused on her, that's when we move. Josiah's gonna ring the bell 3 times, that's the signal. Then we rise, we take the big house, we take the weapons, we take our freedom or we die trying." The men nodded, faces grim but determined. They'd all lost someone to slavery's cruelty. Children sold away, wives whipped to death, brothers hanged for running. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Young Josiah, listening from the shadows, felt his heart racing. He'd been given the most important job, ringing the bell, giving the signal that would start the rebellion. He was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, proud to be trusted with such responsibility. As sunset approached, Hawthorne ordered all the slaves assembled in the yard, the same as he'd done 60 days earlier when Maria was first put in the trunk. They came reluctantly, knowing they'd be forced to witness whatever final humiliation the master had planned. Adana stood at the front of the crowd, her face a mask of grief and barely suppressed rage. She'd already lost a son and a husband to this plantation's cruelty. She wouldn't lose her daughter too, even if it meant dying herself to protect Maria. Hawthorne stood on his porch, Crane beside him, both men dressed in their finest clothes as if this was a celebration rather than a punishment's end. The master's face was smug, confident, certain of his victory over this uppity slave girl who dared to poison him. "Bring her out," Hawthorne commanded. 4 field hands were ordered forward with shovels and crowbars. They began digging around the trunk, exposing the wood that had been half buried for 2 months. The work went slowly, carefully, while the assembled slaves watched in tense silence. Maria felt the trunk shift as the earth around it was removed, felt it being lifted, tilted, moved. The world spun and her stomach lurched, but she kept her grip on the keys, kept them hidden in her palm, kept her breathing steady despite the terror and anticipation coursing through her. They laid the trunk on flat ground. Crane approached with more keys, the ones he kept on his belt, the duplicates of the ones Maria held hidden. He bent to unlock the chains, his face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "Let's see what's left of you, gal," he muttered. "Let's see if Massa's lesson took." The chains fell away with a rattling clang. The iron bands were removed. The wooden slats that had formed the top of Maria's prison were pried off one by one. And finally, after 60 days and 60 nights, the trunk was opened. Everyone gasped at what they saw. Maria's body was a ruin, wasted to nothing, covered in sores and filth. But her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes were alive with such fire that even Hawthorne took a step back. "Help her out," he ordered, his voice uncertain for the first time. 2 men reached in to grab Maria's arms, to pull her from the trunk like they'd pull out a corpse. And that's when she moved. Her right hand, the one clutching the stolen keys, struck like a snake. She drove the longest key straight into the eye of the man leaning over her, drove it deep with strength that shouldn't have existed in her ruined body. He screamed and fell back, blood streaming from his ruined socket. Before anyone could react, before anyone could process what had just happened, Maria was moving again. She'd been planning this for weeks, had practiced the movements in her mind 1,000 times. With her left hand, she grabbed the second man's collar, used his own weight and momentum to pull herself out of the trunk. She fell more than climbed, her legs useless after 2 months of disuse. But she didn't need her legs. Not yet. She had her arms, her rage, and the element of surprise. Crane rushed forward, reaching for his whip. But Maria was faster, rolling across the ground like some broken thing animated by pure will, grabbing a fallen piece of iron chain and swinging it in a wide arc that caught Crane across the knees. He went down hard, cursing. "Now!" Maria screamed, her voice raw but carrying across the yard like thunder. "Now! Rise up! Fight back!" And Josiah, faithful Josiah, rang the bell. 3 times, clear and loud, the signal they'd all been waiting for. The plantation exploded into chaos. Big Moses and his men surged forward, tools and makeshift weapons in hand. Other slaves, emboldened by Maria's example, by her refusal to stay down even after 60 days of torture, joined the uprising. Women grabbed whatever they could find. Children ran for the safety of the quarters, and suddenly, Willow Bend Plantation was burning with the fire of rebellion. Maria, lying in the dirt beside the trunk that had been her prison, looked up at Hawthorne standing on his porch. Their eyes met across the chaos, and she smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd walked through hell and come out the other side changed. Someone who'd become more than human through suffering. Someone who couldn't be stopped now, no matter what happened next. The reckoning had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. Now you see, people. What happened next was something that would be whispered about for generations, something that would become legend among enslaved folks across the South. A story of retribution so perfect, it seemed guided by divine justice itself. The moment Maria struck, the moment that bell rang 3 times, Willow Bend Plantation transformed from an ordered hell into beautiful, righteous chaos. In them days of deep sorrow that was finally becoming days of reckoning, Big Moses led his men in a charge toward the big house. They moved with purpose, with rage that had been building for lifetimes, with the certainty of people who'd chosen to die free rather than live enslaved. The overseer's quarters was their first target. That's where the guns were kept, the real weapons that could turn a slave rebellion into a genuine threat. Thaddeus Crane, down on the ground from Maria's chain strike, scrambled to his feet and reached for the pistol at his belt. But before he could draw it, 3 field hands were on him, beating him with hoe handles, their blows driven by years of accumulated hatred. Each strike was for a loved one whipped, a child sold, a dignity stolen. "This for my boy you sold to Mississippi," one man shouted, his voice breaking. "This for my wife you worked to death in them fields," another cried. Crane went down under the assault, his blood mixing with the Georgia red clay, and Maria watched without pity. This was justice, raw and brutal, the kind that came when the law offered no protection, when the only court was violence and the only judge was survival. But Maria's eyes weren't on Crane. They were fixed on Hawthorne, still standing on the porch of the big house, his face frozen in shock and rage. He'd backed toward the door, was reaching for it, planning to barricade himself inside while his world burned around him. She couldn't let that happen. Her legs still wouldn't work properly. The muscles had atrophied too much, the nerves damaged by 2 months of immobility. But she'd learned from Anansi, from the warrior spirits, from 60 days of surviving the impossible. She didn't need her legs, not for this. Maria began to crawl. Not the desperate, broken crawl of a victim, but the deliberate, predatory crawl of something hunting. Her fingers dug into the earth, pulling her forward. Her eyes never left Hawthorne, and with each movement she grabbed whatever was within reach. Stones, broken wood, chunks of iron from the demolished trunk. Hawthorne saw her coming and laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. "You can't even walk, you crippled wretch. You think you can touch me? I'm your master. I own you." But his voice trembled, because Maria's face, illuminated by the torches that slaves were now using to set fire to the cotton stores, looked like something out of nightmare. Skeletal, fierce, inhuman in its determination. She looked like death itself crawling toward him, and he finally understood what his wife had tried to warn him about. Some things, once broken badly enough, don't heal. They transform into something far more dangerous. "Stop her!" Hawthorne screamed to the few white men still standing. Visiting planters who'd come for dinner, a merchant who'd arrived to discuss cotton prices. But they were backing away themselves, terrified by the scale of the uprising, by the fury in the slaves' eyes, by the realization that they were outnumbered 20 to 1, and the numbers were growing as every slave on the plantation joined the rebellion. Maria reached the porch steps. 3 of them, each one a mountain to someone who couldn't stand. But she'd climbed metaphorical mountains for 60 days. These wooden steps were nothing. She pulled herself up the first step, the second, the third, and then she was on the porch, 10 feet from Hawthorne. Nothing between them but air and reckoning. Hawthorne fumbled with the door behind him, but his hands were shaking too badly to work the handle. His confident cruelty had evaporated, leaving only a coward facing consequences he'd never imagined would come. "Please," he said, and the word was pathetic coming from a man who'd shown no mercy for 60 days. "Please, I'll let you go. I'll free you. Give you papers. You can leave here, go north, I won't stop you." Maria's laugh was terrible to hear, a sound scraped from a throat destroyed by screaming and thirst and suffering. "Free me? You think you got the power to free me now? I freed myself, Massa. I freed myself by surviving what you meant to kill me with." She pulled herself closer, using the porch railing, using furniture, using pure determination. Hawthorne pressed against the door, trapped by his own cowardice. "What do you want?" he whimpered. "Justice," Maria said simply. "For my baby brother you allowed to be murdered. For my daddy you sold away. For my mama you whipped. For every soul you destroyed with your greed and your cruelty and your pride." She was close now, close enough to touch him. But she didn't strike yet. Instead, she looked around the chaos of the plantation yard. Big Moses and his men had secured the weapons, were now facing down the few white overseers who'd tried to fight back. Slaves were everywhere, some fighting, some fleeing toward freedom, some just standing in shock at their own rebellion. And there, near the trunk that had been Maria's prison, stood Adana, her mama watching with tears streaming down her face, watching her daughter's impossible survival, her impossible vengeance. Maria met her mama's eyes across the distance, saw the grief there, but also the pride, saw the understanding that what was about to happen was necessary, was earned, was the only possible ending to this story. Then Maria turned back to Hawthorne, and with the last of her strength, with power borrowed from ancestors and spirits and 60 days of refined rage, she lunged, not at his body, at his feet. She grabbed his ankles and pulled, using his weight against him, using gravity and surprise. Hawthorne toppled backward, falling, his head arcing toward the porch railing. But Maria, in a move that seemed impossible for someone so broken, rolled. She positioned herself, and as Hawthorne fell, she guided his descent so that his skull would strike the one thing that mattered, the one object that held all the symbolism of her suffering. The trunk. The massive oak trunk that had been carried up to the porch as evidence of the punishment's success. It sat there, jagged-edged where the top had been pried off, stained with Maria's blood and sweat and tears. Hawthorne's head hit the trunk's sharp edge with a sound like a melon splitting. Crack, the same sound baby Joseph's neck had made when Crane shook him to death. The same sound of bone breaking, of life ending, of justice served cold and brutal. Blood exploded from the impact, spraying across the trunk, across Maria's face, across the porch. Hawthorne's body convulsed once, twice, then went still. His eyes stared up at nothing, already glazing over, the light fading from them like a snuffed candle. Elias Hawthorne, master of Willow Bend Plantation, killer of countless slaves, architect of Maria's 60-day torture, was dead. Killed by the very instrument of punishment he'd devised, destroyed by the girl he'd tried to break. For a moment, everything went silent. The fighting stopped. The screaming ceased. Every eye turned to the porch where Maria lay beside Hawthorne's corpse, her hand still gripping his ankle, her face painted with his blood. Then someone shouted, "He's dead! The master's dead! Maria killed him!" And the plantation exploded with cheers, with cries of jubilation, with the sound of chains, literal and metaphorical, finally breaking. Slaves poured into the big house, taking everything they could carry. Others ran for the roads, heading north while they had the chance. Some stayed to destroy what they couldn't take, smashing furniture, burning cotton stores, demolishing the symbols of their oppression. Big Moses ran to the porch, his face split with a fierce grin. "You did it," he said to Maria, his voice filled with awe. "Sweet Jesus, you actually did it." Maria couldn't respond. She'd used everything she had in that final attack. Her body was shutting down, the adrenaline that had kept her moving draining away, leaving only the reality of 60 days of damage, of infection, and starvation, and trauma too severe for any body to withstand much longer. Adana pushed through the crowd, scrambled up the porch steps, gathered her daughter into her arms. "My baby, my fierce baby," she sobbed, rocking Maria like she was a child again. "You did it. You survived. You fought back. I'm so proud of you." "Mama," Maria whispered, her voice failing. "Mama, I'm tired." "I know, baby. I know. You can rest now. You can rest." But there was no time for rest. In the distance, they could hear dogs barking, horses thundering. The patrollers were coming, alerted by the smoke and the chaos. The slave rebellion at Willow Bend would bring down terrible retribution. They all knew it. Innocent slaves on neighboring plantations would be hanged in revenge. The militia would hunt down every escaped slave they could find. "We got to go," Big Moses said urgently. "Now, before they surround us. Anyone who wants freedom, anyone who can run, we leave now for the swamps. The Maroons will take us in." "I'll carry her," Adana said, trying to lift Maria. But the girl was dead weight now, barely conscious. Maria's eyes flickered open one last time. She looked at her mama, at Moses, at Josiah, who'd appeared beside them, his young face streaked with tears. "Go," she whispered. "Run. Get to freedom. Don't let my suffering be for nothing." "Not without you," Adana insisted. But Maria smiled, peaceful now, her work done. "I'm already free, Mama. Already free. The trunk couldn't hold me. Death can't hold me neither. My spirit's gonna fly home to Africa, gonna dance with the ancestors, gonna tell them we fought back. We didn't just endure. We struck back." Her eyes closed. Her breathing grew shallow. And Adana knew with the terrible certainty of a mother's intuition that her daughter was leaving, that the damage was too great, that Maria had held on through sheer will, but now that will was finally spent. "No," Adana sobbed. "No, baby, don't leave me alone." But Maria was already gone, her spirit slipping away like smoke, leaving behind only the shell that had survived 60 days in hell. She died on the porch of the big house, beside the corpse of the man who'd tried to break her, her blood mixing with his, victor and victim both finding their end in violence. The patrollers arrived an hour later to find Willow Bend burning. Most of the slaves fled, and 2 bodies on the porch, master and slave locked in death's final embrace. They would call it a tragedy, a cautionary tale about being too lenient with slaves. They would use it to justify even harsher laws, even more brutal punishments. But among the enslaved, among the survivors who made it to the swamps and told their story, among the free blacks in the north who heard about Maria do Tronco, the girl who survived the trunk and killed her master with his own instrument of torture, among them, it became legend. It became proof that resistance was possible, that even the most broken among them could still fight back, that masters weren't invincible, that the system of bondage could be struck at its heart. Maria's story spread like wildfire, whispered in quarters, sung in coded spirituals, passed down from generation to generation. And every time a slave contemplated rebellion, every time someone refused to break despite torture, every time someone struck back against their oppressor, Maria's spirit was there, proof that freedom was worth dying for. The reckoning she'd promised had come, and though it cost her life, though her body failed at the moment of triumph, her spirit would live forever in the hearts of her people, a flame that no amount of water could drown, no amount of cruelty could extinguish. She was Maria de Tronco, and she would never be forgotten. Listen here now, 'cause what happened after Maria's death was both triumph and tragedy, freedom and fury mixed together like blood and water. The night Willow Bend burned, the night the slaves rose up and struck back, it became a turning point that would echo through history, a moment when the oppressed showed their teeth and the oppressors learned that cruelty has consequences. In them days of reckoning that followed deep sorrow, Big Moses stood in the yard of the burning plantation and made a choice that would save lives. He looked at the chaos around him, slaves running in every direction, some toward freedom, some just running blind, and he knew they needed organization, needed leadership, needed someone to turn rage into strategy. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice carrying over the crackling flames and the sound of destruction. "We got maybe an hour before the militia comes in force. Anyone who wants to live free, follow me to the swamps. We head for the maroon settlements where they can't track us. But move now, move fast, and take only what you can carry." Adana still knelt on the porch, cradling Maria's body, rocking back and forth in grief. She'd lost Joseph to murder, lost Kofi to sale, and now lost Maria to vengeance. Every person she loved had been taken by this cursed system of bondage. Josiah approached her carefully, his young face streaked with tears. "Miss Adana," he said gently, "we got to go. The patroller's coming, and they gonna kill everyone they find here. Maria wouldn't want you to die after she fought so hard." "How can I leave her?" Adana sobbed. "How can I leave my baby girl lying here like trash?" Old Bessie appeared then, moving faster than her ancient bones should have allowed. She placed a gnarled hand on Adana's shoulder. "Child, that ain't Maria no more. That's just the shell she left behind. Her spirit already gone. I can feel it. She's dancing with the ancestors now, free as she always wanted to be. You want to honor her? Live. Get to freedom. Tell her story, so nobody forgets what she did here. Adana looked down at her daughter's face, peaceful now despite the blood and the trauma. She bent and kissed Maria's forehead one last time, whispered prayers in Kimbundu, the language of her homeland, the tongue Maria had spoken in her final spiritual visions. I'll tell them, baby, she promised. I'll make sure every slave from here to Canada knows your name, knows what you did, knows that we can fight back. Then she stood, her legs shaking but her spine straight, and joined the stream of people fleeing toward the swamps. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and the mojo bag around her neck, the one old Bessie had made for her after Joseph died, the one that contained grave dirt from her son's resting place, and now would carry the memory of her daughter too. Big Moses organized the flight with military precision. He divided people into groups. The fastest runners went first to scout the path. Families with children went next, protected by strong men. The elderly and injured came last with guardians to help them. Near 70 slaves from Willow Bend made that desperate flight through the darkness, following Moses toward the deep swamps where the Maroons had lived free for generations. Behind them, Willow Bend blazed like a funeral pyre. The big house burned brightest, flames consuming the symbol of white supremacy, reducing Hawthorne's empire to ash and memory. The cotton stores burned too, months of harvest going up in smoke, wealth built on suffering returning to nothing. Even the slave quarters burned, though some questioned that choice. Why burn our own cabins? Someone asked. Because they ain't ours, Big Moses answered. They cages, same as that trunk was for Maria. We burn them so nobody else gets trapped in them, so the next master who tries to rebuild this place knows it's cursed ground. But not everyone fled. Some of the house slaves, too frightened to run, hid in the root cellar. A few field hands, broken too completely to believe freedom was possible, stayed behind, knowing they'd be punished but unable to imagine life beyond the plantation. And Constance Hawthorne, the master's young widow, was found wandering in shock, her nightgown soaked in her husband's blood, her mind shattered by the violence she'd witnessed. The patrollers arrived with the dawn, 30 armed white men on horseback with dogs straining at their leashes. They found the smoking ruins, found Hawthorne's body on the porch beside Maria's, found the few slaves who'd remained. Their fury was terrible to behold. The patrollers hanged 5 slaves from the big oak tree without trial, without question. Just vengeance masquerading as justice. They were the ones who'd stayed behind, the ones who hadn't even participated in the rebellion. But that didn't matter. Someone had to pay, and black bodies were always acceptable currency for white rage. News of the Willow Bend uprising spread like wildfire across Georgia and beyond. Slaveholders trembled, increased their patrols, tightened their control. But among the enslaved, a different message traveled. They whispered about Maria Dutronco, the girl who survived 60 days of torture and killed her master with his own punishment device. They sang about her in coded spirituals, turned her into a symbol of resistance that no amount of repression could silence. Did you hear about the girl in Georgia? Slaves would whisper across plantation boundaries. The one who wouldn't break? The one who struck back? I heard she had powers, another would respond. That the ancestors walked with her, that she could work conjure strong enough to shake the earth. I heard she's still alive, a third would add. That she didn't really die, just disappeared into the spirit world and comes back to help slaves who are suffering. The truth and the legend mixed together until it was hard to separate one from the other. But that was the power of Maria's story. It became bigger than the facts, became mythology, became a promise that resistance was possible. Meanwhile, in the swamps of southern Georgia, the fleeing slaves from Willow Bend finally reached the Maroon settlement after 3 days of desperate flight. The Maroons, escaped slaves who'd built a hidden community in the bayous, living free for years beyond White Reach, welcomed them with cautious solidarity. You brought trouble with you, the Maroon leader, a scarred man named Solomon, said to Big Moses. They gonna hunt you hard for killing a master." "I know," Moses replied, "but we couldn't stay enslaved no more." Maria showed us that death with dignity beats life in chains. Solomon nodded slowly. He'd heard the story already, passed along by runners and scouts. "This Maria," he said, "she really kill Hawthorne with that trunk he put her in?" "She did." Adana spoke up, her voice fierce despite her grief. "I watched it happen. Watched my daughter, broken and dying, still find the strength to make him pay. She was touched by the ancestors, carried power from the crossroads. Ain't nobody ever gonna convince me different." The Maroons took them in, though resources was scarce and the risk was great. They taught the Willow Bend refugees how to survive in the swamps, what plants to eat, how to avoid the patrollers, how to build shelters that couldn't be seen from the waterways. It was hard living, dangerous and uncertain, but it was freedom. And after a lifetime of bondage, freedom tasted sweet even when seasoned with fear. Josiah adapted quickest of all. The boy who'd risked everything to help Maria became a valuable scout for the Maroons. His small size and quick mind perfect for sneaking past patrols, gathering information, helping other slaves escape to the settlement. "I do this for her," he'd say when people thanked him. "For Miss Maria. She taught me that even the smallest person can make a difference if they brave enough." Weeks turned into months. The manhunt for the Willow Bend rebels gradually lost intensity as other crises demanded attention. Some of the refugees eventually made it further north, following the Underground Railroad to Pennsylvania and beyond. Others stayed in the swamps, built lives among the Maroons, raised children who would be born free even if they lived hidden. Adana stayed. She became a storyteller for the Maroon community, keeping Maria's memory alive, turning her daughter's suffering and triumph into lessons for the young. She'd gather children around the fire at night and tell them about the girl who wouldn't break, who turned torture into transformation, who proved that masters wasn't invincible. "Your ancestor Maria," she'd say to children who'd never met her daughter but claimed her legacy anyway. "She showed us something important. She showed us that we ain't just victims. We got power too, even when they try to strip it away. We got the strength of our ancestors, the wisdom of our elders, the courage to fight back when fighting back seems impossible." And old Bessie, who'd survived the destruction of Willow Bend by disappearing into the woods before the patrollers arrived, became the Maroon settlement's root doctor and conjure woman. She carried Maria's story too, but in a different way. Through ritual and root work, through mojo bags and protection spells, through connecting the living to the dead. Maria walks among us still, Bessie would tell those who came seeking her wisdom. Her spirit strong, angry at injustice, hungry for freedom. You want her help? You live brave like she did. You resist like she did. You never let them break you no matter what they do. The settlement grew, became a beacon for runaways, a symbol of possibility, and always at its heart was the story of Maria de Tronco, the girl who survived the unsurvivable, who struck back when striking back seemed impossible, who died free even though she died young. Her legacy lived in every slave who chose resistance over submission, in every mother who whispered strength to her children, in every man who looked at his chains and imagined breaking them. She became eternal, mythic, a spirit of rebellion that haunted the nightmares of slaveholders and lit the dreams of the enslaved. The reckoning she'd started at Willow Bend didn't end with her death. It was just beginning. Now listen here, people, 'cause I need to tell you about the years that followed, about how Maria's story became woven into the fabric of resistance, about how her spirit lived on in the bayous and swamps where freedom seekers built their own world beyond white reach. This is where legend and life mixed together, where the dead walked with the living, where Maria de Tronco became more than a girl. She became a force. In them days of hard-won freedom, the Maroon settlement deep in the Georgia swamps grew into something powerful and strange. It warn't no paradise. Life there was brutal in its own way, full of hunger and disease and the constant fear of discovery. But it was chosen struggle, not imposed bondage, and that made all the difference in the world. The settlement itself was built on land that seemed cursed to white folks, deep in the bayou where Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like the beards of drowned men, where the water ran dark as ink and alligators lurked in the shallows. The Maroons had learned to read the swamp like a book, knew which paths was safe and which would swallow you whole, knew how to move silent through water and mud, knew how to disappear like smoke when danger approached. Solomon, the Maroon leader, had been free for 15 years, having escaped from a rice plantation in South Carolina. He ran the settlement with an iron hand tempered by wisdom, keeping order among people who'd known only chaos and oppression their whole lives. "We got rules here," he'd tell newcomers, his scarred face serious. "First rule, we all free, but we all responsible for each other. Second rule, you don't steal from your own people. Third rule, you see patrollers, you sound the alarm before you run. And fourth rule, you respect the ancestors, you honor the spirits, you remember where you came from." It was this fourth rule that made Maria's story so important to the settlement. Adana became the keeper of memory, the one who ensured that the young ones born in the swamp understood the price of their freedom, understood what it cost to get here. She'd sit by the fire in the evening, when work was done and the settlement gathered for the one meal they shared communal, and she'd tell the story. But it changed over time, the way all oral histories do, growing larger and more mythic with each telling. "My daughter Maria," she'd begin, her voice carrying the weight of years and grief. "She was born with the sight, touched by powers older than slavery. When they put her in that trunk, when they tried to bury her alive for daring to fight back, the ancestors came to her. They walked with her through 60 days and 60 nights of suffering, teaching her secrets, giving her strength, preparing her for the moment of reckoning." The children would lean forward, eyes wide. They'd heard the story before, but it never got old, never lost its power to inspire and terrify. "And when they finally opened that trunk," Adana would continue, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper, "Maria rose up like Lazarus from the grave, like Moses with the power of God behind him, like every warrior ancestor we got combined into one fierce girl. She struck down her tormentors, killed the master with his own instrument of torture, and set Willow Bend ablaze with the fire of righteous vengeance." It weren't exactly how it happened. Maria had been more dead than alive when they pulled her out. Her final attack more desperate than powerful, her death coming quick after her vengeance. But the truth and the legend didn't have to match perfect. The point was the lesson, the message, the inspiration. "Tell us about her powers," one child would inevitably ask, and Adana would smile, sad and proud at once. She could speak to spirits, could call on the ancestors for help. She could work conjure strong enough to protect others from pain. I saw her do it with my own eyes, and at the end, when she struck Hawthorne down, the very earth shook with approval, with the ancestors celebrating justice served. Old Bessie, listening from the shadows, would nod and add her own testimony. "I taught that child what I could," she'd say, her ancient voice crackling like dry leaves. "But she had power I couldn't teach, power that came from walking between worlds, from suffering so deep it opened doors that most folks never see. She became a bridge, you understand? A bridge between the living and the dead, between the world of bondage and the world of freedom." Big Moses, now one of Solomon's trusted lieutenants, would add his piece too. "Maria taught us that we ain't helpless," he'd say. "Even when they got all the power, all the weapons, all the law on their side, we still got our dignity, our courage, our willingness to die rather than submit. She proved that resistance is possible, that fighting back is worth it even if you don't survive." And Josiah, grown now into a young man, would talk about the practical lessons he'd learned from helping Maria. "She taught me that even small acts of defiance matter," he'd say. "That bringing water to someone's suffering, that ringing a bell when it's time to rise up, that being brave when you scared to death. All of that matters. You don't got to be a hero to make a difference. You just got to be willing." The story spread beyond the settlement, carried by runaways who passed through on their way north, by traders who dealt with the Maroons despite the danger, by slaves from nearby plantations who snuck away to the swamp's edge for secret meetings. Within a few years, Maria's name was known across the South. Different versions of her story circulated. Some said she'd survived and was still alive in the swamps, a conjure woman who helped runaways. Some said she'd become a spirit herself, a haint that haunted cruel masters and protected the enslaved. Some said she'd made it north and was working with abolitionists, planning more rebellions. None of it was true, but all of it was truth of a different kind. Maria lived in the hearts and minds of enslaved people, became a symbol bigger than any one person's life or death. She was hope made manifest, resistance given form, the proof that the powerful could be brought low. The Maroon Settlement became known as a place where Maria's spirit was strong, where her protection extended to all who sought freedom. Runaways would make their way to the swamps asking for the place where Maria walks, and the Maroons would understand they meant the settlement, would guide them in if they could. Old Bessie set up a special place in the settlement, a small clearing where she said Maria's spirit came to visit. She built an altar there, decorated with items that represented Maria's story. A piece of wood from an oak tree to symbolize the trunk, a rusty chain to represent bondage, a sharp stone to represent the keys she'd used as a weapon, and red clay from Georgia to represent the blood spilled in the fight for freedom. People would come to this altar to pray, to ask for strength, to commune with Maria's spirit, and Bessie claimed, and many believed, that Maria answered, that her presence could be felt in that clearing, that she still watched over her people from beyond the veil. She ain't gone, Bessie would insist to anyone who'd listen. She just changed form. She's in the wind that warns us when danger's coming. She's in the fire that keeps us warm. She's in the water that hides our tracks. She's everywhere we need her to be. Years passed. The Maroon Settlement endured, grew, became a thorn in the side of Georgia slaveholders who couldn't root it out no matter how hard they tried. Children who'd been born free in the swamps grew up hearing about Maria, absorbing her story with their mother's milk, carrying her legacy into the next generation. Adana lived to old age, never stopping her storytelling, never letting Maria's memory fade. When she finally died, peaceful in her sleep at nearly 70 years old, the settlement buried her with great ceremony. They placed her body in the earth with a piece of oak wood in her hands, a remembrance of the trunk, a symbol that she was returning to her daughter at last. She going to join Maria now, people said at the funeral. Going to dance with the ancestors, going to rest after all these years of keeping the memory alive. Old Bessie died not long after, having lived to an age nobody could quite calculate. On her deathbed, surrounded by those she'd taught her conjure wisdom to, she smiled and whispered, "I see her. I see Maria waiting for me. She's still fierce, still proud, still burning with that fire. Tell the young ones to keep fighting. Tell them the reckoning ain't over. Tell them Maria's story lives as long as there's chains to be broken." Big Moses lived longest of all the original Willow Bend refugees. He became a legend himself, leading raids to free slaves from nearby plantations, organizing the underground railroad routes through the swamps, building a network of resistance that lasted decades. When he was finally killed in a shootout with patrollers in 1859, just 2 years before the Civil War that would end slavery forever, his last words was about Maria. "Tell them," he gasped, bleeding out in the mud of the bayou. "Tell them Maria du Tronco showed us the way. Tell them we followed her example all these years. Tell them the reckoning she started, it's still going. It's gonna keep going till every chain is broken." And Josiah, who survived them all, who lived to see slavery end and Reconstruction begin, who became a preacher and a teacher in the freed community. He never stopped telling Maria's story. He told it to his children and grandchildren, told it in churches and schools, told it to white folks who came asking about the old days. "You want to know about slavery?" he'd say, his old eyes still fierce despite his age. "You want to understand what it was really like? Then let me tell you about a girl named Maria, about 60 days in a trunk, about suffering turned to strength, about vengeance earned and delivered. Let me tell you about the day the oppressed struck back and the earth itself shook with approval. He lived to be nearly 90 years old, died in 1910, and with him passed the last living witness to Maria's story. But the legend lived on, passed through generations, adapted and changed but never forgotten. Maria do Tronco, the girl who wouldn't break, the girl who struck back, the girl who proved that even in the deepest hell the human spirit could survive, could resist, could triumph. Her story wasn't just history, it was prophecy, it was promise. It was proof that freedom was worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth becoming a legend for. And in the hearts of every person who ever resisted oppression, who ever stood up to tyranny, who ever chose dignity over submission, Maria's spirit lived on, eternal and undefeated. Now listen here, people, 'cause we come to the end of this tale, but endings ain't always what they seem. Some stories don't end. They just keep going, passing from mouth to mouth, heart to heart, generation to generation, until the line between history and legend blurs like mist on water. This is one of them stories. This is Maria do Tronco's eternal legacy. In them days when slavery finally crumbled, when the Civil War tore through the South like divine retribution, when chains broke and plantations burned and the old order collapsed into ash, people remembered Maria. They saw her spirit in every act of resistance, felt her presence in every moment of triumph, heard her voice in the thunder of Union cannons that brought freedom's terrible price. Old folks who'd known her story would sit with the young ones, the ones born after emancipation who couldn't quite grasp what bondage had been like, and they'd say, "You think freedom came easy? You think Lincoln just signed a paper and it was done? No, child. Freedom was built on the backs of people like Maria, people who fought back when fighting back meant certain death, people who said no more when saying no could get you buried alive." The legend grew in ways that would have made Maria herself laugh if she could have heard them. They said she was 7 feet tall and strong as 10 men. They said she killed not just Hawthorne but a dozen overseers with her bare hands. They said the trunk couldn't hold her because she could walk through wood like it was water, because the ancestors made her body as insubstantial as smoke when she needed to escape. None of it was true, but all of it was truth. Because Maria hadn't been 7 feet tall, she'd been a half-starved girl who barely reached 5 feet. She hadn't killed a dozen men. She'd killed one, using his own cruelty against him. She hadn't walked through the trunk. She'd suffered in it for 60 days, her body breaking even as her spirit strengthened. But the exaggerations didn't matter. What mattered was the core truth. A young girl had endured the unendurable, had struck back against impossible odds, had proven that the enslaved wasn't helpless victims, but potential warriors waiting for their moment. The physical Willow Bend plantation never recovered. After the rebellion, after the fires, after the deaths, no one wanted to rebuild it. The land lay fallow for years, and locals said it was haunted, said you could hear screams on certain nights, said Maria's spirit walked the ground seeking justice for all who'd suffered there. Eventually, after the war, the land was broken up and sold to freedmen, former slaves who farmed the soil that had once been watered with their ancestors' blood. They built new cabins where the old quarters had stood, planted crops where cotton had once grown, and tried to make something good from land that had seen such evil. But they never touched the spot where the trunk had stood. That patch of red Georgia clay remained bare, marked only by a rough wooden cross that someone had planted there. It became a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to remember, to pray, to connect with the past. Old Bessie's spiritual altar, the one she'd maintained in the Maroon settlement, was eventually moved to a small church built by freedmen near what had been Willow Bend. The congregation, mostly former slaves and their children, kept the tradition alive. They'd gather on the anniversary of Maria's death, tell her story, sing spirituals in her honor, and renew their commitment to the fight for true freedom. Not just legal freedom, but economic freedom, social freedom, the freedom to live with dignity and without fear. "She's still watching over us," the preacher would say, a man who'd been born in the Maroon settlement and carried Maria's story in his bones. Sister Maria do Tronco, she's still here, still fighting alongside us. Every time we stand up to injustice, she's standing with us. Every time we refuse to bow down, she's refusing with us. Every time we remember where we came from and who paid the price for our freedom, she's smiling in the spirit realm. The story jumped from the south to the north, carried by the Great Migration when black folks fled Jim Crow and sharecropping for factory jobs in Chicago, Detroit, New York. In Harlem speakeasies and South Side churches, in Detroit auto plants and Philadelphia row houses, Maria's name lived on. You think you got it hard? Old folks would say to young people complaining about discrimination, about poverty, about the weight of racism. Let me tell you about Maria do Tronco. Let me tell you about what real suffering looks like and what real resistance looks like too. And the young people, initially skeptical, would listen and find themselves moved. Because Maria's story wasn't just about suffering. It was about agency, about refusing to accept oppression, about fighting back even when the odds was impossible. The story even reached Africa, carried back by missionaries and travelers, by those who sought to reconnect with the homeland their ancestors had been stolen from. And there, in Angola where Adana had been born, people claimed Maria as their own, said her spirit had returned to African soil, that she danced now with the Mbundu warriors who'd fought the Portuguese slavers. She was ours first, they'd say with pride. Born of our blood, carrying our strength, she showed the world what African people are made of, what we can endure, what we can overcome. As decades passed into a century, as the civil rights movement erupted and black people once again stood up to demand their rights, Maria's name was invoked in meetings and marches, in churches and freedom schools. She became a symbol alongside Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, proof that resistance had deep roots, that the fight for freedom was generations old. Remember Maria do Tronco, activists would say before facing police dogs and fire hoses. Remember the girl who survived 60 days in hell and still struck back. If she could do that, we can face Bull Connor. We can face the Klan. We can face whatever they throw at us. And still the story lived on. Into the late 20th century, into the 21st, passed down through families taught in Black history classes, researched by scholars trying to separate fact from legend. Books were written, plays were performed, songs were composed, all trying to capture the essence of Maria's story, to keep her memory alive for generations who'd never known slavery, but needed to understand its legacy. Some questioned whether she'd really existed, whether the story was just myth created to inspire the oppressed. But those who knew, who'd heard it from their grandparents, who'd heard it from their grandparents, who carried the story in their blood and bones, they knew Maria was real. Don't matter if you can prove it in some white man's court, they'd say. Don't matter if there's documents or records, we know, we remember. And as long as we remember, she lives. And on certain nights, in certain places, people swear they can still feel her presence. In the Georgia swamps where the Maroons built their freedom. In the soil of what was once Willow Bend Plantation. In the hearts of anyone who's ever suffered under oppression and refused to break. They say if you listen real careful, you can hear her voice in the wind, singing those old spirituals, calling on the ancestors, promising that justice might be delayed but never denied. They say she walks with every person who stands up to tyranny, lends her strength to every act of resistance, smiles every time someone chooses dignity over submission. Maria do Tronco, the girl in the trunk, the girl who wouldn't break, the girl who struck back and changed everything. Her body died in 1836, broken but unbowed, on the porch of a burning plantation. But her spirit? Lord have mercy. Her spirit never died at all. It lives in every heart that refuses to submit, in every voice that speaks truth to power, in every hand that reaches out to help another who's suffering. She became eternal. She became mythic. She became proof that one person, no matter how small, no matter how oppressed, can make a difference that echoes through centuries. And me? I'm just an old storyteller, keeping her memory alive, making sure the young ones understand what their ancestors endured, what they fought for, what they won with blood and tears and unbreakable will. So I'll leave you with this. Remember Maria. Remember her suffering and her strength. Remember that she was real, that her pain was real, that her triumph was real. Remember that the fight for freedom never really ends. It just changes form, and we all got a role to play in continuing what she started. Remember that cruelty always plants the seeds of its own destruction. Remember that the oppressed ain't helpless, that resistance is always possible, that justice might take time, but it comes for those who wait for it, work for it, die for it if they have to. Remember Maria de Tronco, and in remembering, honor her. Honor all those who suffered in bondage. Honor all those who fought back. Honor all those who died so we could live free. Their stories, their struggles, their victories and defeats, they all matter. They all live on. And as long as we keep telling these stories, as long as we refuse to forget where we came from and what it cost to get here, then the ancestors ain't really dead. They walking with us still. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted left memory behind. And memory, we keep it here, in the scars of history, in the voices that refuse to be silenced, in the broken chains that still echo. The whipping post did not hold her. Death did not silence her. And her spirit? It still marches, still sings, still bears witness to what cannot be erased. Here, in the echoes from the quarters,